There is a particular kind of institutional trust that builds slowly, across decades, and then one morning you realize it has become invisible, woven so completely into the fabric of daily life that you cannot imagine the world without it. Pond's Extract Company understood this before anyone in the beauty industry had a framework for the concept. In 1952, a survey conducted by a women's magazine editorial board found that more American households kept a jar of Pond's cold cream within arm's reach of the bathroom sink than kept a box of aspirin in the medicine cabinet. Read that sentence again slowly. The cold cream was more reliably present than the pain reliever. That is not a footnote in American beauty history. That is the entire story of what mid-century cosmetic trust actually meant. Pond's did not arrive in the 1950s as a newcomer scrambling for market share. The company had been manufacturing its extract-based preparation since 1846, founded by pharmacist Theron T. Pond in Utica, New York, after he discovered that witch hazel distillate possessed remarkable healing properties when applied to the skin. By the time the Second World War ended and the post-war economy began its extraordinary climb, Pond's had spent nearly a century teaching American women how to think about skincare as a nightly discipline rather than an occasional luxury. That foundation of institutional patience would prove almost impossible for any rival to dismantle, no matter how aggressively they advertised. The two-cream system, cold cream paired with vanishing cream, was the cornerstone of the Pond's commercial philosophy throughout the 1940s and into the early 50s. The cold cream was marketed explicitly as a cleanser and overnight conditioner, a product you applied at the end of the day to dissolve the theatrical mask of foundation, rouge, and powder that mid-century beauty culture required women to maintain in public from morning until the moment they crossed their own front threshold. The vanishing cream, by contrast, was a lighter, quickly absorbed preparation intended as the morning base beneath makeup, a kind of smoothing primer before the word primer existed in the cosmetic vocabulary. Together they constituted a complete morning-to-night ritual, and Pond's sold them as a system with extraordinary deliberateness. The advertising campaigns that sustained this empire through the post-war decade were remarkable for their sociological ambition. Pond's did not simply pitch its products at housewives. The company commissioned a series of testimonial advertisements featuring women of genuine aristocratic lineage, European countesses, American socialites, the occasional British duchess, applying cold cream at mahogany dressing tables while speaking, in the measured cadences of women accustomed to being listened to, about the discipline of skin preservation. These were not fictional composites or actresses hired to play wealthy women. Pond's paid real titled women to lend their names and photographs to the campaign. The implicit argument was extraordinary. If the women who had every material advantage in the world still relied on Pond's cold cream, then the product was beyond aspiration. It was simply the correct choice, the rational conclusion any sensible woman would reach, regardless of her station. Inside the jar itself, the product was a marvel of mid-century cosmetic chemistry that most consumers never thought to examine closely. Pond's cold cream was built on a water and oil emulsion base, meaning the formula consisted of a water phase suspended within a large oil phase, held in stable combination by an emulsifying agent. The primary oil component in the classic formula was mineral oil, refined to pharmaceutical clarity, supplemented by beeswax and spermaceti. The latter, a waxy substance historically derived from sperm whale oil, that gave the cream its characteristic smooth, almost silken texture on application. The fragrance was light, powdery and slightly floral, a deliberate choice to make the cleansing ritual feel luxurious rather than clinical. When a woman pressed her fingertips into a freshly opened jar of Pond's and drew them across her face in slow circular motions, she was engaging in a sensory experience carefully engineered to feel like self-care rather than maintenance. The competitive environment around Pond's in the early 1950s was genuinely fierce, though the challenges came at the brand from different angles. Noxzema skin cream, which had been on the market since 1914, competed in the cold, cream and cleanser space with a sharply distinctive eucalyptus and clove fragrance that made the product feel medicinal and therefore rigorous. A different kind of trust, built on the suggestion of clinical efficacy rather than aristocratic endorsement. Jergens Company, headquartered in Cincinnati, offered a range of skin preparations that competed at the drugstore tier. Dorothy Gray, a premium brand available at department store cosmetic counters, positioned itself explicitly above Pond's in price and implied social standing, though it never achieved the same cultural penetration. What none of these competitors could replicate was the specific nature of the trust Pond's had accumulated. It was not the trust of a luxury purchase, earned fresh each time through the pleasurable friction of spending more than you needed to. It was the trust of a household staple, earned through repetition and reliability, until the product's presence on the vanity shelf felt as natural and unremarkable as the presence of soap beside the sink. A woman who used Pond's every night for 20 years did not think about whether to buy Pond's when her jar ran out. She simply bought Pond's the way she bought table salt. By the mid-1950s, the Pond's portfolio had expanded considerably beyond the original two-cream system. The company introduced Pond's Dry Skin Cream, formulated with a heavier oil content specifically for women dealing with the particular dryness that central heating and post-war suburban domestic life induced. Pond's Angel Face was a pressed powder compact product, launched in 1950 to compete directly in the colour cosmetics space that Revlon and Max Factor were beginning to dominate. The powder came in a pale lilac box with decidedly feminine typography, and was sold with its own powder puff, a small luxury that reinforced the sense that Pond's understood the complete vocabulary of a woman's dressing routine. The territory Pond's commanded throughout the 1950s was something more profound than market share. It was emotional real estate, the specific square footage of a woman's daily private ritual where she was most herself, most unguarded, most honestly tending to her own comfort. No other brand in the beauty industry had colonized that territory so thoroughly or so early. When historians look at the mid-century American cosmetics landscape and try to understand how trust was built before the age of influencers, before the democratization of beauty expertise through digital media, before the vast infrastructure of modern consumer research, the answer they keep arriving at is deceptively simple. Pond's showed up consistently for over a century in the most intimate moments of women's daily lives, and it never gave them a reason to look for something better. That kind of trust does not expire. It becomes, eventually, the water in which everything else swims. The modern beauty consumer navigating the overwhelming abundance of a contemporary cosmetic retailer, the thousands of serums, the competing cleansing philosophies, the algorithmic personalization engines that promise to match each individual skin concern with its precise molecular solution, exists in a world that Pond's helped build by insisting for 100 years that good skin began with a simple nightly discipline and a product you could reach for without thinking. The sophistication came later. The reliability was always the foundation. The regional distribution network that Pond's maintained throughout the continental United States in the 1950s was itself a monument to the post-war logistics revolution. The company operated through a system of regional sales territories that covered every state, with dedicated representatives calling on drugstores, general stores, and department store cosmetic departments on rotating schedules designed to ensure that the familiar white jar never disappeared from retail shelves long enough for a consumer to be forced to try something else. This sounds like ordinary commercial practice, but in the context of a period when refrigerated trucking was still being standardized, when the interstate highway system was only beginning to alter the fundamental geography of American distribution, and when the radio and early television infrastructure of national advertising was just consolidating into the powerful tool it would become, The logistical coherence of Pond's distribution network represented a substantial competitive advantage that no amount of creative advertising alone could have purchased. The cultural work that Pond's cold cream did in the 1950s extended beyond the simple provision of a cleansing and conditioning preparation. It functioned as a rite of passage, a marker of female adulthood. Girls who had watched their mothers and grandmothers perform the nightly cold cream ritual grew up with the product embedded in their earliest sensory memories of womanhood. The particular sound of the jar's lid being unscrewed, the cool temperature of the cream drawn from the container, the specific motion of circular application that the product almost demanded by virtue of its consistency. When those girls became women and began their own beauty routines, the choice of Pond's was not experienced as a brand decision in any meaningful commercial sense. It was the continuation of a practice they had absorbed by observation before they had words for what they were observing. This generational transmission was Pond's most valuable asset and the aspect of its market position that no competitor with a superior formula could easily disrupt. You cannot out-formula a childhood memory. You cannot out-advertise a practice that feels like inheritance. The woman who reached for Pond's at 35 because her mother had used it was not evaluating the product against alternatives in any rigorous sense. She was performing a gesture of continuity, a small daily confirmation that she was participating in something larger than a cosmetic routine, a lineage, a tradition, a set of practices passed woman to woman across generations with the quiet authority of things that have always simply been done. The packaging evolution that Pond's navigated throughout the decade reveals the brand's confidence in its own institutional authority. Where Revlon refreshed its visual language aggressively each season to signal relevance and currency, Pond's made changes to its packaging with deliberate conservatism, treating the familiar white jar and blue-black label as assets to be protected rather than liabilities to be redesigned. Small refinements in typography and colour registration appeared across the decade, but the fundamental visual identity remained stable enough that a jar purchased in 1958 was immediately recognisable as the same brand the purchaser had first encountered a decade earlier. This stability was itself a commercial statement. It said that the product did not need to claim novelty, had not been reformulated into obsolescence, and trusted its own history as sufficient recommendation. The broader context of post-war American skincare culture gives Pond's dominance an additional dimension of meaning worth examining. The 1950s were not a decade notable for sophisticated consumer understanding of skin biology. The mechanisms by which the skin barrier functioned, the distinction between hydration and lubrication, the role of various fatty acid chains in epidermal health, these were scientific territories that professional dermatology was only beginning to map with any rigour, and the translation of whatever dermatological knowledge existed into consumer cosmetic products was at best imprecise, and at worst actively misleading. Within this environment of genuine scientific uncertainty about what skincare products were actually doing to and for the skin, the safest consumer position was to trust what had been used continuously across generations without apparent harm. Pond's cold cream had been used by enormous numbers of women for nearly a century without producing the kind of visible adverse outcomes that would have generated concern. That record of use, that century of uncontroversial application, was, in the absence of more sophisticated evaluative tools, a reasonable proxy for safety and efficacy. The brand's longevity was itself a form of clinical trial, conducted at enormous scale across an uncontrolled but very large population. By the later years of the 1950s, the first inklings of a different relationship between consumers and cosmetic products had begun to appear. The thalidomide crisis, though it concerned a pharmaceutical rather than a cosmetic preparation, had begun to erode the post-war faith in chemistry's essential benevolence. Consumer advocacy writing was beginning to gain an audience. Vance Packard's Examinations of Advertising and Consumerism, published in the late 50s, were widely read and widely discussed, and they raised questions about the relationship between brand mythology and product reality that had not previously been asked in so public a forum. The regulatory environment for cosmetic claims was beginning to tighten, if gradually. The world in which a face cream could be advertised with hormone claims and aristocratic testimonials without significant scrutiny was not yet over, but it was beginning to change in ways that would eventually transform every brand in the industry. Pond's navigated this transition with the calm that comes from knowing your foundation is solid. A brand that has always made conservative, supportable claims about its products, that cold cream cleanses, that it conditions the skin, that nightly use as part of a consistent routine produces visible improvements in skin quality over time, has less to fear from a regulatory environment that begins to scrutinize cosmetic advertising than a brand that has made more ambitious claims on thinner scientific foundations. The simplicity of the Pond's value proposition, which had sometimes seemed like a disadvantage against the more theatrically ambitious competitors, proved in this moment to be a form of institutional resilience. The women who reached for the white jar in 1959 were reaching for exactly what the jar had always contained, a well-formulated emollient preparation that worked as it claimed, required no faith in scientific promises that could not be kept, and asked nothing of its user except that she take a few minutes each night to do something kind for her own face. In the spring of 1952, a nail polish advertisement ran in the pages of Vogue magazine and stopped women dead in the middle of their page-turning. The image showed a lacquered hand, nails the precise colour of arterial blood, resting against the cool grey of an oyster shell. The copy read simply, "Where's the fire?" The brand was Revlon. The colour was fire and ice. And that single campaign, which debuted in earnest later that same year, represents one of the most audacious acts of consumer seduction in the history of American retail. Charles Revson founded Revlon in 1932 with his brother Joseph and a chemist named Charles Lackman, the L in the brand's name. The company began with nail polish, a product that existed before Revlon, but had never been treated as an object of genuine prestige or emotional complexity. Revson understood, with a clarity that bordered on the prophetic, that nail colour was not fundamentally a cosmetic product. It was a statement, a position, a tiny theatrical gesture a woman made about who she believed herself to be on any given day. He priced accordingly. He advertised accordingly. He built an entire corporate philosophy around the idea that a woman did not buy a bottle of nail polish. She bought an identity, rented for the duration of the manicure. By the early 1950s, Revlon had extended from nail polish into lipstick, and it was the lipstick that completed the company's transformation from cosmetic manufacturer into cultural force. Revson had a peculiar genius for colour naming, a skill that sounds trivial until you understand that the name of a cosmetic shade is not decoration. It is the first argument the product makes for itself, the frame through which the consumer encounters everything that follows. Revlon shades carried names like Cherries in the Snow, Bachelor's Carnation, Persian Melon, and Plum Gorgeous. These were not descriptions of colours, they were invitations to a mood, a season, a fantasy of femininity that the lipstick promised to unlock if the woman simply reached for it. The Fire and Ice campaign of 1952 deserves extended attention because it broke nearly every rule of post-war cosmetic advertising and succeeded so completely that it rewrote those rules for the following decade. Most beauty advertising of the period trafficked in aspiration through propriety. You could be lovely, the implicit argument went, if you were also tasteful, restrained, appropriately feminine. Revlon's Fire and Ice campaign suggested something considerably more complicated. The advertisement featured model Dorian Lee in a silver sequined gown and scarlet cape, wearing a shade of lipstick and nail colour that was simultaneously red and pink, warm and cool, flagrantly sensual and somehow still elegant. The accompanying copy listed a series of personal questions asking women whether they had ever danced with their shoes off, or wished on a new moon, or secretly preferred champagne to punch. These were not questions about refinement. They were questions about the existence of a private self that had desires, the public presentation of post-war femininity required to remain carefully suppressed. The campaign was a scandal and a triumph simultaneously. Women's magazines ran editorials about it. Department store cosmetic counters reported that the matching lipstick and nail colour had sold out within days of the advertisement's publication. The New York Times covered the campaign as a cultural event rather than a commercial one. Revlon had done something that no cosmetic brand had managed with such precision before. He had made a woman feel that buying a lipstick was an act of self-assertion rather than self-decoration. That distinction seems subtle. Its commercial implications were enormous. Inside the Revlon laboratory, the technical work that underpinned these theatrical presentations was substantial and genuinely innovative. Revlon's nail polish formulations in the early 1950s were built on a nitrocellulose base suspended in a mixture of solvents, with plasticizers added to prevent brittleness and ensure flexibility as the lacquer dried to its characteristic hard film. The pigment suspension technology that allowed Revlon to achieve its vivid, consistent colours, that specific depth of red, that precise quality of coral, was the result of years of formulation work that the company protected fiercely. The lipstick division operated similarly, using castor oil as the primary conditioning base and building colour through careful layering of organic dyes and inorganic pigments to achieve both the visual depth Revlon demanded and the staying power that consumers had come to expect. Revlon's relationship with the television era of the early 1950s deserves its own chapter in any honest history of mid-century cosmetics. The brand became the exclusive sponsor of the CBS quiz program The $64,000 Question when it launched in 1955, and the strategic logic was impeccable. The show attracted enormous audiences. Some broadcasts drew 30% of the American television viewing population, and the Revlon commercial breaks that punctuated each episode were produced with the same theatrical ambition as the brand's print campaigns. The commercials were not film demonstrations of product application. They were short films about desire, status, and the particular quality of attention a beautifully groomed woman could command in a room. The show's success made Revlon's television investment legendary. The commercial's quality made the brand synonymous with a kind of aspirational femininity that reached women who had never walked into a department store cosmetic counter in their lives. The company's expansion through the mid-decade was extraordinary. Revlon introduced new product categories with the same colour-naming philosophy it had applied to nail polish and lipstick. Foundation products carried names like translucent base. Eyeshadow compacts used the vocabulary of jewels and fabrics. And the whole apparatus of a woman's makeup routine was gradually colonized by the Revlon brand identity. The coral and gold packaging that the company standardized in the early 50s was immediately recognizable across the cosmetic counter's crowded surface, a visual signature as deliberate as a fashion house monogram. What Revlon achieved throughout the 1950s was something that seems almost paradoxical in retrospect. It democratized luxury. The products were available at drugstores, not just department stores. The price points were real-world, not prohibitive. But the advertising, the packaging, and above all the philosophy of colour as identity made every purchase feel like the acquisition of something genuinely precious. A woman buying a tube of cherries in the snow at the local Rexall was, within the Revlon symbolic system, participating in the same aspirational narrative as the Vogue reader, encountering fire and ice in a glossy spread. That seamless continuity between the mass market and the luxury register, the ability to make the same product feel like a bargain and an indulgence simultaneously, was Charles Revson's deepest commercial achievement, and it changed the beauty industry's understanding of what a brand could be. The women who built their colour vocabulary around Revlon in the 1950s were not brand loyalists in the modern marketing sense. They were participants in an ongoing conversation about who they were permitted to be, and who they secretly wanted to be, and Revlon kept offering them new languages for that conversation every season. The names changed, the colours shifted, the fantasy refreshed itself, and women kept reaching for it decade after decade in the particular bright faith that the right red lipstick might change something fundamental about the quality of a Tuesday morning. The manufacturing operations that underpinned Revlon's commercial brilliance in the 1950s were housed primarily in a plant in Oxford, North Carolina, where the company had consolidated much of its production capacity during the post-war expansion. The facility was, by the standards of the period, a genuinely modern cosmetic manufacturing environment, temperature and humidity controlled to ensure consistent emulsion stability, equipped with high-speed filling lines for the lipstick tubes that were the brand's primary commercial product, and organised around quality control protocols that Revson himself monitored with a degree of personal involvement that his production managers found alternately inspiring and exhausting. Revson was not a scientist. He could not have written the organic chemistry of a lipstick formulation from first principles. But he possessed a sensory acuity about the finished product, its texture, its drag on application, the specific way a shade read in different lighting conditions, that functioned as an informal but highly effective quality control mechanism. The shade development process at Revlon in the early 1950s was a genuine exercise in colour theory applied to the peculiarities of lip tissue. The company employed full-time colourists, a role that had no precise equivalent in most other industries, whose function was to translate the seasonal colour direction Revson set, in consultation with the fashion world he watched closely, into stable cosmetic formulations that would produce the intended visual result on a range of different skin tones and under the variety of lighting conditions a consumer might encounter across a day. This was more technically demanding than it sounds. A shade that appeared perfectly calibrated in the warm incandescent light of a 1950s bathroom mirror might read differently under the fluorescent office lighting that was becoming increasingly prevalent in post-war commercial architecture, and differently again in the natural light of a lunch counter or a department store. The colorist's job was to anticipate and manage these variations so that the consumer's experience of the shade on her face matched, as closely as possible, the experience of encountering it in the advertising image. Revlon's expansion into international markets during the mid-decade brought the brand into a different kind of cultural conversation about what red lipstick meant. In European markets where the brand launched through licensing arrangements and eventually direct distribution, the Revlon colour philosophy arrived with the full weight of its American cultural associations. The post-war prosperity, the cinematic glamour, the particular self-confidence that the advertising projected, but encountered local beauty traditions with their own sophisticated histories and different assumptions about the relationship between colour and femininity. The French response to Revlon was particularly interesting, since France possessed its own robust cosmetic industry with deep historical roots and a different aesthetic philosophy. Where Revlon's American advertising proposed colour as emotional statement and identity declaration, the dominant French cosmetic tradition emphasised understatement, natural enhancement, and the idea that the best makeup was invisible. The negotiation between these philosophies, as Revlon entered the French market, produced advertising adaptations that reveal how much of what seemed universal about the brand's appeal was in fact specific to the American post-war cultural context in which it had developed. The women's magazine ecosystem that Revlon's advertising supported, and that in turn made Revlon's brand building possible, was itself a remarkable feature of mid-century American media culture. Publications like Vogue, Harper's Bazaar, Glamour, Mademoiselle, 17, and Good Housekeeping each commanded devoted readerships with specific demographic profiles, and the cosmetic advertising that filled their pages was calibrated to those profiles with increasing sophistication across the decade. Revlon's colour-focused, emotionally charged advertising appeared most heavily in the aspirational fashion titles, Vogue and Harper's Bazaar for the affluent reader, glamour and mademoiselle for the younger professional woman. The company's more prosaic drugstore line advertising appeared in Good Housekeeping and Women's Day, adjusted in tone and visual register to address a different set of aspirations and constraints. This advertising segmentation was not simply media buying strategy. It was a simultaneous performance of multiple brand identities, each tailored to a specific reader's relationship with beauty culture, executed with enough consistency in the core visual and colour language to remain recognisably Revlon across every context. The cultural conversation about women's roles that ran beneath the surface of all 1950s cosmetic advertising became, by the mid-decade, impossible to entirely ignore even in the pages of a lipstick advertisement. The ideal of the beautifully groomed domestic woman that post-war culture had constructed with such deliberateness was beginning to fray at edges that even the most carefully crafted advertising imagery could not entirely conceal. The college-educated women who constituted Revlon's most ardent customers were in many cases living lives of considerable domestic confinement that sat uneasily with the intellectual and professional ambitions their education had cultivated. The lipstick that promised fire and ice was selling in part to women who could not easily access fire and ice in the terms the culture most respected: professional achievement, public recognition, economic independence, and who were finding in the vivid, charged aesthetic of Revlon's colour philosophy a form of self-expression that the available channels of their lives permitted. This is not a cynical observation about cosmetic advertising's function. It is an honest account of the genuine emotional work that beauty culture performed for women in a period of real constraint. The lipstick was not false consolation. It was genuine, if partial and insufficient, access to the experience of choosing, of asserting, of being seen as the specific woman one wished to be rather than the general category of woman the culture preferred. Revlon understood this at some level better than any competitor, and built an advertising philosophy around it that connected more directly to women's actual emotional experience than the safer, more conventional approaches of rival brands. The commercial success that resulted was real and substantial. The trust it represented was real and substantially earned. Charles Revson was a difficult and often ruthless man, but he understood something true about what women wanted and offered it to them in the most vivid terms he could arrange. The most important makeup artist in American history never worked on a paying civilian client. Maximilian Faktorowicz, who simplified his name to Max Factor when he emigrated from Poland to the United States in 1904, spent his professional life serving the peculiar optical requirements of theatrical and cinematic lighting, developing products to make faces read correctly under conditions that stripped ordinary makeup of its usefulness and turned untreated human skin into a grey, featureless mask. In doing so, he accidentally invented the entire vocabulary of modern cosmetics. Nearly everything a woman reached for at a drugstore cosmetic counter in the 1950s could trace its direct genealogy to something Max Factor had first developed in a Hollywood studio 30 years earlier. The origin story of Factor's American influence begins with the Nickelodeon and early motion picture industry's move to Southern California, which created an immediate crisis. The orthochromatic film stock used in early cinema was extraordinarily sensitive to blue light and blind to red, which meant that lips appeared nearly black on screen. That ordinary complexion powder turned the face an unsettling grey under studio lamps, and that the theatrical grease paint performers had used on stage for decades photographed as a grotesque, streaky disaster. Factor, who had operated a theatrical makeup business in St. Louis before moving to Los Angeles, recognized the problem and began experimenting. By 1914, he had developed a flexible grease paint formulation specifically engineered for motion picture use, lighter and more blendable than stage grease paint, consistent in its photographic behavior across different lighting conditions, and available in a range of calibrated tones that Factor numbered with the same clinical precision a pharmacist might apply to a compounding formula. By the early 1930s, when the major Hollywood studios had standardized their approach to lighting and color correction, under the new panchromatic film stocks that could register the full visible spectrum, Factor had already moved to the next problem, pancake makeup. The society makeup he developed and refined throughout the 1930s was a water-activated pressed cake formula that applied with a damp sponge, dried quickly to a uniform matte finish, and provided sufficient coverage to eliminate shine under the harsh new Technicolor lighting rigs that were beginning to replace the softer orthochromatic setups. Society makeup, later marketed under the consumer name pancake makeup, was arguably the most important single cosmetic innovation of the 20th century's first half. It introduced American women to the concept of a foundation that did not feel like grease, did not require powder to set, and could be applied quickly enough to function in ordinary daily life, rather than only in the extended preparation rituals of the film studio. Pancake launched in the consumer market in 1940, and was an immediate commercial phenomenon of a scale that Max Factor's publicity team initially struggled to describe without sounding implausible. The product moved through department stores and drugstores at a rate that exceeded the company's manufacturing capacity within the first months of availability, and the waitlist that formed at cosmetic counters were documented by women's magazines as a social event. The kind of scarcity-induced desire that made the product's eventual arrival on each waiting woman's vanity shelf feel genuinely significant. By the early 1950s, Pancake and its slightly lighter-bodied successor, Pan Stick, a cream foundation packaged in a distinctive push-up tube that allowed application directly from the container, were installed features of the mid-century woman's cosmetic vocabulary. The Max Factor brand's relationship with Hollywood remained the centerpiece of its consumer advertising throughout the 1950s, and the company managed this relationship with extraordinary sophistication. Factor himself had died in 1938, but the business he built, which his sons and the broader corporate structure continued, maintained deep operational relationships with every major studio and supplied makeup to the productions that defined the era's visual culture. When Rita Hayworth appeared in a Columbia Pictures release with that particular warm copper bronze foundation that made her skin read as luminous under studio lights, that was Max Factor. When Ava Gardner's complexion achieved its characteristic velvety depth in an MGM production, that was Max Factor. The company was invisible in the credits but present in every frame, and its consumer advertising spent lavishly on making that invisible presence known. The advertising strategy was built around the concept of the tested face, the idea that the products had been evaluated not by ordinary women in ordinary light, but by the most critical optical instruments in the world, the Technicolor cameras and the perfectionist cinematographers of Hollywood's golden decade. An advertisement for Max Factor Pan Stick in 1953 did not simply show a woman with beautiful skin. It showed a woman whose skin had passed the Hollywood test, whose complexion had survived the unforgiving scrutiny of the camera and the Klieg light, and emerged not merely acceptable, but actually beautiful. That was a different and considerably more powerful claim than any competitor without a Hollywood laboratory could make. The company's colour philosophy differed interestingly from Revlon's in this period. Where Revlon built its consumer identity around the emotional charge of colour names, the fantasy implicit in Fire and Ice or Persian Melon, Max Factor organised its colour system around the language of science and precision. Foundations came in colour harmony shades, cross-referenced by skin tone classification in a way that echoed laboratory notation. Lipstick shades were organised by colour families and labelled with the terminology of professional makeup artistry: coral rather than sunset, rose rather than romance. This was not an accident. The Max Factor brand was telling a different story about what cosmetics were. Not fantasy objects, but precision instruments. Products whose effectiveness derived from technical mastery rather than emotional association. Both stories were compelling. They were targeting slightly different anxieties. The Revlon consumer worried about being insufficiently vivid. The Max Factor consumer worried about being insufficiently correct. The distribution footprint that Max Factor maintained throughout the 1950s was enormous and deliberately varied. The brand was present at the high end of the department store cosmetic counter, available at Marshall Fields in Chicago, at Feline's in Boston, at the better Macy's locations in New York, but also penetrated deeply into the drugstore tier through products positioned as accessible interpretations of the Hollywood standard. This dual presence gave Max Factor a particular kind of cultural authority. It was simultaneously the brand of the movie stars and the brand available to the woman buying her groceries at the drugstore. The implied argument was that the science behind the product did not change based on where you purchased it. The legacy of Max Factor's 1950s formulations is visible throughout the subsequent history of the industry in ways that are occasionally difficult to trace, precisely because the brand's innovations were so thoroughly absorbed into the general cosmetic vocabulary. Foundation as a skin tone matched product, rather than a whitening preparation, Max Factor. The systematic cross-referencing of complexion products by undertone rather than simply by depth, Max Factor. The idea that a cosmetic product's quality could be certified by its performance under conditions far more demanding than ordinary life, Max Factor. These seem like obvious ideas now. They were not obvious ideas when they were new. They required a man who spent decades watching light hit human faces under every possible condition, and then spent decades more translating what he had learned into products that could survive being opened and handled and applied by women without a makeup artist's training in a bathroom with ordinary incandescent light. That is a specific, unglamorous, technically demanding achievement, and the trust that American women placed in Max Factor throughout the 1950s was precisely commensurate with the seriousness with which the company had earned it. The professional makeup kit that a working Hollywood makeup artist carried in 1952 was, in most of its fundamental elements, a reorganization of Max Factor products into the specific configurations demanded by a given production's requirements. The pancake foundations in their numbered shades, 18 and several dozen more, each calibrated to a specific depth and undertone for specific lighting conditions and film stocks, occupied the uppermost tray of the heavy black case. Below them sat the lining colours, the highlight and shadow preparations used to sculpt facial architecture that the camera would read correctly even when the actor was 20 feet from the lens. The lip and cheek colours occupied their own compartments. The setting powders, the removal preparations, the adhesives for facial hair prosthetics, the specialised preparations for character work and period accuracy. All of it was Max Factor, organised with the efficiency of long professional habit. This professional infrastructure was invisible to the consumer. The woman buying pan stick at a drugstore cosmetic counter had no direct knowledge of the technical lineage that connected her foundation to the studio production she watched at the Saturday matinee. But the invisible connection was doing real cultural work. The products she purchased had been tested in the most demanding optical environment that human beings had yet devised for the purpose of looking at human faces. They had been used on the most photographed faces of the era, under conditions of scrutiny so intense that a formula flaw or a colour error would be visible to millions of people across hundreds of screenings. The consumer who trusted Max Factor was trusting not simply a cosmetic manufacturer, but a system of professional testing so thoroughgoing that its quality assurance function made ordinary consumer quality concerns seem almost trivially easy to satisfy. The racial politics of Max Factor's product range in the 1950s represent a dimension of the brand's history that deserves direct acknowledgement. The numbered shade system that Factor had developed for professional use was calibrated, in its primary range, to the complexions of the predominantly white performers who worked in major studio productions during the classical Hollywood period. The African-American performers who worked in film, and whose screen presence was both constrained by the industry's segregationist casting practices and when present subject to the same unforgiving optical demands as their white counterparts, required either specific adaptations of the existing range or the development of entirely separate formulations. Max Factor produced some product for this use, but the systematic approach to shade inclusivity that contemporary foundation ranges attempt to embody was simply not a priority in the post-war period, and the consequence was that women of colour had significantly more limited access to the kind of carefully matched foundation product that the brand's professional reputation implied it could provide. The consumer advertising that Max Factor ran throughout the 1950s managed the Hollywood connection with considerable narrative sophistication. Rather than simply showing a celebrity endorsing a product, the most straightforward form of the studio-to-consumer connection, the advertising often showed the product in process, the application itself, the transformation from face to presentation. This behind-the-scenes framing was unusual in cosmetic advertising of the period, which generally preferred to show the finished effect rather than the procedure. Max Factor's willingness to show the application step, the sponge against the skin, the blending motion, the before and after implicit in the sequence, communicated technical confidence. It said, "This product works, and we are not afraid to show you how it works because the working is the point." The ingredient transparency that Max Factor practiced in its consumer-facing communication, while limited by the standards of later decades' more rigorous disclosure requirements, was nevertheless more detailed than most competitors attempted. Product copy for Pan Stick and related formulations in the early 50s mentioned the pigment concentration, the skin adherence properties, and the water resistance characteristics of the formula in language that was accessible to a non-technical reader, without being condescending or vague. This communication approach reflected the brand's underlying philosophy that the consumer deserved to understand what she was buying within the limits of what could be communicated in the space available on a cosmetic package or in a magazine advertisement. It was not a philosophy universally shared by the industry, and its relative distinctiveness contributed to the brand's authority with consumers who approached their purchases with more than ordinary commercial attentiveness. The role that Max Factor played in the standardization of cosmetic color vocabulary throughout the industry deserves particular note. The numbered shade systems, the skin type classification language, the distinction between undertone and depth that the brand's professional makeup training materials articulated clearly, all filtered gradually into the broader industry's approach to organizing and communicating about complexion products. By the middle of the 1950s, language that Max Factor had developed within the context of professional studio makeup was appearing in the advertising and counter-training materials of brands that had no direct professional makeup heritage, evidence that the professional cosmetic vocabulary, in its clearest and most functional form, was a Max Factor invention that had escaped into the general commercial culture and become so naturalized there that its origin was no longer visible. The women who chose Max Factor from among the available cosmetic options in the early 1950s were making a specific and interesting trust decision. They were choosing a brand whose authority rested on technical performance rather than social aspiration, on the optical perfection of a film frame rather than the emotional charge of a fashion image. In a market that offered multiple compelling reasons to buy, the fantasy of Revlon, the prestige of Helena Rubinstein, the democratic elegance of Coty, the Max Factor proposition was in some ways the most empirically grounded. This product had been used in circumstances where failure was visible, had been tested in conditions far more demanding than any consumer would encounter, and had survived that testing well enough to remain the standard tool of the most technically sophisticated makeup artist in the world. That was, for the right consumer, the most persuasive possible recommendation. In 1950, a biochemist named Hazel Bishop filed a patent for a new class of lipstick formulation and began selling the resulting product from a single rented counter at a Bamberger's department store in New Jersey. Within 2 years, Hazel Bishop Incorporated had captured approximately 25% of the American lipstick market, outselling brands with 30 years of name recognition, enormous advertising budgets, and the accumulated institutional weight of cosmetic industry dominance. This is one of the most extraordinary market disruption stories in American business history, and it happened because Bishop had solved the one problem that every woman who wore lipstick in the 1940s and early 50s understood as a daily irritation so familiar it had become invisible. The lipstick came off. The technical achievement behind Hazel Bishop's no-smear lipstick requires some explanation, because its elegance is genuinely impressive. Conventional lipstick formulations of the period used castor oil as their primary carrier base, which gave the product its characteristic smooth application and moisturizing texture, but also meant the colorants were sitting in a medium that transferred easily to cups, collars, cheeks, and the faces of anyone the wearer encountered in greeting. The colour was a temporary painting on the surface of the lips, subject to the frictional entropy of ordinary life. Bishop, who had trained as a chemist and worked for Standard Oil, and later for an aviation medicine research program before turning her attention to cosmetic chemistry, approached the problem from a technical angle that the beauty industry's established players, who were primarily businessmen and advertisers rather than scientists, had not prioritized. Her solution involved reformulating the color delivery mechanism entirely. Rather than suspending dye in an oil base, Bishop's formula used a different chemical architecture, bromoacid dyes that had an affinity for the lip tissue itself, bonding to the surface at a molecular level rather than simply coating it. The resulting lipstick applied with the same smoothly pigmented experience a woman expected, but the colour adhered to the lips with a tenacity that was genuinely startling the first time you experienced it. Drinks didn't remove it. Conversation didn't remove it. The usual evidence of lipstick wear, the ring on the coffee cup, the smear on the napkin, the ghost of colour transferred during any physical contact, was dramatically reduced. The lipstick did what it claimed on the package. It stayed. The commercial implications of this technical innovation were immediate and large. Women who tested the product at Bishop's Bamberger's counter and found that it actually worked came back. They told their friends. They wrote letters to women's magazines. The organic word-of-mouth endorsement that accumulated around Hazel Bishop's no-smear lipstick in its first year of distribution had a momentum that money could not have purchased as efficiently. It was the testimony of women who had been surprised by a product performing as advertised, which in the cosmetic industry of that period was not the ordinary experience. Bishop's advertising, when she could afford to buy it, leaned hard into the performance claim rather than the fantasy register that Revlon had established as the industry standard. Where Revlon advertisements invited women into a mood, a season, a charged emotional scenario, Hazel Bishop advertisements made a simple declarative promise: this lipstick will not come off. The copy was almost confrontationally matter-of-fact by the standards of the era. The visual language was cleaner and less theatrical than the glamour-soaked imagery that dominated department store cosmetic advertising. This directness was not a failure of creative sophistication. It was a strategic choice rooted in Bishop's scientific training. She understood that the product's primary asset was its technical performance, and that the most persuasive thing she could do was state the performance clearly, and let women's direct experience confirm it. The corporate story of Hazel Bishop Incorporated through the early 1950s is complicated by the fact that Bishop herself was eventually pushed out of the company she founded. Her business partner Raymond Spector, who had provided early funding and taken a controlling interest, ultimately won a boardroom confrontation that left Bishop without her own company. She went on to teach at the Fashion Institute of Technology in New York and to continue working in cosmetic chemistry. But the commercial enterprise she had built on her technical innovation was no longer hers. The brand continued under Spector's control, expanding its product range and maintaining its market position through the mid-decade before eventually fading, as competitors absorbed the lesson of long-lasting formulations and developed their own versions. The irony of Bishop's displacement from her own company is particularly sharp given that the brand's entire competitive identity rested on her scientific work. Without Hazel Bishop's chemistry, there was no Hazel Bishop lipstick. The corporate structure that Spector built around her innovation was commercially sophisticated but technically hollow. It was packaging and advertising and distribution organized around a chemical achievement that Bishop alone had produced. This pattern, in which a woman's technical or creative contribution was appropriated by a better capitalized male business partner, was not unusual in the post-war commercial landscape. It is worth naming clearly because the history of mid-century cosmetics contains many versions of this dynamic. For the women who bought Hazel Bishop lipstick throughout the early 1950s, though, none of this corporate drama was visible from the cosmetic counter. What was visible was a product that worked, the shade range that the company offered, a respectable spectrum from pale pinks through medium roses and into the deeper reds that the era's fashion required for evening, was not as dramatically named or as theatrically presented as Revlon's colour vocabulary. It didn't need to be. The competitive claim was not about the fantasy the colour could deliver. It was about the practical reality that the colour would remain where the woman had placed it long enough to actually be seen. By 1954, the cosmetic industry's major manufacturers had all introduced their own versions of longer-lasting lipstick formulations, inevitably borrowing from the technical vocabulary that Bishop's patents had established. Revlon's long-wearing formulas appeared. Coty developed its own resistant preparations. The market that Hazel Bishop had created through genuine chemical innovation was absorbed and replicated until the specific competitive advantage of the original product was diluted by the availability of alternatives. This is the standard arc of innovation in consumer markets. The breakthrough becomes the baseline. But in Bishop's case, the speed of the competitive response was particularly sharp, driven by the obvious commercial urgency of matching a rival who had captured a quarter of the market in 2 years. The trust that women extended to Hazel Bishop's lipstick in its early years was a particular and unusual kind of consumer faith, not the faith of loyalty built through decades of reliable presence, as Pond's had earned, and not the faith of aspiration cultivated through theatrical advertising, as Revlon had engineered. It was the trust of a product that had been tried and found to do exactly what it said it would do. In a market saturated with claims and images and carefully constructed emotional associations, that simple confirmation, yes, this actually works, was perhaps the most powerful endorsement a cosmetic could receive. Bishop understood that. Her misfortune was in partnering with people who valued the commercial apparatus she could build around her chemistry more than they valued the chemistry itself. The laboratory environment in which Hazel Bishop developed her non-smear lipstick formula was not a purpose-built cosmetic research facility. It was, for the earliest years of her experimentation, a home laboratory, a converted domestic space equipped with a chemical apparatus that a trained biochemist could assemble through a combination of professional connections and resourceful purchasing. Bishop had been thinking about the lipstick problem from her vantage point as a chemist and as a consumer simultaneously, which gave her a quality of analysis that the cosmetic industry's professionally trained businessmen who thought about lipstick primarily as a commercial object rather than a chemical formulation did not possess in the same integrated form. She understood what the product was supposed to do, understood why current formulations failed to do it consistently, and approached the problem with the systematic rigor of a trained scientist rather than the intuitive empiricism of a product developer, working backward from a desired result. The specific challenge that eosin dye chemistry presented to Bishop's formulation work was considerable. Eosin, the bromo acid dye that became the key colorant in her long-lasting formula, had been used in various chemical applications, including biological staining procedures in laboratory settings, but had not been developed as a cosmetic colorant in systematic form before Bishop's work. The challenge was not simply getting the dye to bond with lip tissue, which it did reliably due to its pH-reactive chemistry. The challenge was achieving this bonding while also producing a cosmetically acceptable texture on application, a full range of appealing colors, and a preparation stable enough to survive the manufacturing, shipping, and retail storage conditions that a commercial product would encounter without degrading in ways visible to the consumer. Each of these requirements imposed constraints on the formulation that the others complicated, and working through the interactions, the way a change in solvent composition affected both texture and colour stability, the way adjustments to the dye concentration changed the bonding chemistry, and therefore the final shade, required the kind of systematic experimental iteration that Bishop's scientific training equipped her to conduct rigorously. The patent she filed in 1950 encoding the results of this work was detailed and defensible, but it could not prevent competitors from studying its claims and developing alternative routes to similar results. The fundamental insight that a different chemical relationship between colorant and lip tissue could produce longer-lasting color than the conventional castor oil-based system was now public knowledge. The specific implementation that Bishop had patented was protected. The broader territory of long-lasting lipstick formulation was not, and the major cosmetic manufacturers who had the research capacity to develop alternative approaches began doing exactly that within months of Hazel Bishop's commercial success becoming visible in retail sales data. The retail expansion that Hazel Bishop Incorporated undertook during its period of rapid growth in the early 1950s was managed with the particular mixture of determination and undercapitalization that characterized many new consumer brands of the period. The original Bamberger's counter gave way to a broader department store distribution network, which gave way in turn to drugstore placement, the decisive entry into mass-market distribution that gave the brand the volume and revenue to sustain its growth. Each expansion of the distribution footprint required investment in manufacturing capacity, in the sales force necessary to call on new retail accounts, in the advertising that generated consumer awareness and pull-through in accounts that had not previously carried the brand. Bishop's scientific genius was not matched by commensurate financial resources, and the resulting dependence on outside capital created the vulnerability that eventually cost her control of the company she had built. The consumer press coverage that Hazel Bishop received during the brand's early ascent was remarkable, both for its enthusiasm and for the particular angle of the story it told. Here was a woman scientist, not a socialite turned businesswoman in the mode of Helena Rubinstein or Elizabeth Arden, but an actual trained biochemist who had solved a problem that the entire cosmetic industry had not solved and was building a company on the resulting innovation. This narrative had considerable appeal to the women's magazines that covered the brand's launch, because it offered a version of mid-century feminine success that operated outside the conventional categories of beauty as aspiration or domesticity as fulfillment. Bishop was succeeding through technical expertise, through the application of rigorous scientific method to a problem that others had approached less systematically. The story was, in its way, a quiet argument about what women's minds were capable of that the more explicit discourse of the period rarely permitted. The shade range with which Hazel Bishop launched and expanded her lipstick line reflected the commercial realities and aesthetic assumptions of the early 1950s with complete accuracy. The colours were organised around the central red-pink coral axis that mid-century fashion required, with sufficient variation in depth and undertone to serve different complexion types and seasonal palettes. What the range notably lacked was the adventurousness, the specifically charged nomenclature, the provocative colour stories that made Revlon's colour line a cultural event as much as a cosmetic offering. Bishop's shades were named decorously and described in practical terms. They did not invite the wearer into a narrative about who she was or who she might become. They promised simply to stay where she put them for the duration of the day, which was a different and in some ways more honest promise than the emotional transformations other brands implied their colours could deliver. The regulatory landscape in which Hazel Bishop operated in the early 1950s was, by contemporary standards, remarkably permissive of cosmetic product claims. The Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938 had established a framework for cosmetic regulation that required safety but imposed relatively limited constraints on efficacy claims. A lipstick manufacturer could promise that her product was long-lasting without being required to substantiate the claim through controlled testing under pre-specified conditions. Bishop's no-smear claim was, as it happened, completely accurate and easily verifiable through ordinary use, which made the regulatory leniency irrelevant in her specific case. But the regulatory environment she operated in tells us something important about the commercial culture of the period. The primary accountability mechanism for cosmetic claims was not government oversight, but consumer experience, and a brand that made promises it could not keep faced eventual market consequences rather than immediate regulatory ones. There was a specific species of confidence that a woman carried when she left a department store cosmetic counter in the 1950s, a physical adjustment of posture, a slight forward lift of the chin, that had nothing to do with the products she had just purchased and everything to do with what the experience of purchasing them had confirmed about her. The department store cosmetic counter was not primarily a retail transaction point. It was a social ceremony, a site of evaluation and affirmation conducted in a very particular theatrical space, and the brands that occupied those counters understood the ceremony far better than they understood the chemistry of what they were selling. Dorothy Gray was among the most sophisticated practitioners of this ceremony in mid-century America. Dorothy Gray began as a salon, founded in New York in 1916 by a Hungarian immigrant named Ada de Acosta Root, who borrowed the invented name Dorothy Gray from a friend and built around it a beauty institution on Fifth Avenue that served wealthy women seeking both skin treatments and the social validation that proximity to expertise and luxury provided. The salon expanded into a product line, the product line expanded into national department store distribution, and by the post-war decade, Dorothy Gray occupied a specific and carefully maintained tier of the cosmetic market, above the drugstore brands in price and implied prestige, below the genuine luxury Europeans like Germaine Monteil or Elizabeth Arden in cost and exclusivity, but possessed of a particular department store gravitas that its competitors at the same price point struggled to match. The Dorothy Gray counter at a major department store in the early 1950s was a specific environment. The countertop was glass, the back wall was mirrored, and the products were arranged with a deliberate, slightly austere elegance of objects that were intended to be contemplated before purchase. The sales consultants, they were never called saleswomen, that word carried too strong a transactional scent, were trained in the particular combination of technical knowledge and social deference that the brand's aspirational positioning required. They could discuss formulations, skin types, and application technique with sufficient authority to establish their expertise, while simultaneously making the customer feel that she was the final and most authoritative judge of what her skin required. This balance was not achieved accidentally. It was trained, scripted, and enforced by corporate standards that Dorothy Gray maintained with considerable seriousness. The product range itself was organized around a philosophy of skin treatment that positioned Dorothy Gray as something between a cosmetic brand and a therapeutic one. The Velvaleg film, a liquid product applied to the legs to simulate the appearance of stockings without the expense of actual hosiery, was a practical wartime innovation that the brand carried forward into the early 50s as a summer convenience product. The hormone cream line, which Dorothy Gray promoted with the kind of confident quasi-medical language that the Federal Trade Commission would eventually move to restrict, promised cellular regeneration and decelerated visible aging through the application of estrogen-enriched preparations to the face. These claims were not scientifically established in any rigorous sense, but they existed within a regulatory environment far more permissive than any that would be possible today, and women who purchased them were operating on the basis of a cultural faith in chemistry's capacity to solve the problems of aging that was widespread in the post-war period, and not unreasonable given the genuine scientific advances of those decades. The hormone cream category deserves more attention than it typically receives in accounts of mid-century cosmetics, because it illustrates something important about the relationship between cosmetic science and consumer trust in that era. The 1940s and early 50s were a period of genuine rapid chemical discovery across many fields simultaneously. The development of penicillin and subsequent antibiotics had demonstrated that invisible molecular interventions could transform apparently intractable biological problems. The application of industrial chemistry to agriculture, to food processing, to synthetic fabric production, to dozens of other ordinary material categories, had created a cultural assumption that chemistry was essentially benign and essentially productive, that if something chemical had been added to a preparation, the preparation had been improved. Dorothy Gray's hormone creams and the similar preparations offered by competitors, including Estee Lauder, Helena Rubinstein, and Princess Pat, inhabited this assumption with commercial intelligence. The technical language of cellular biology, applied to a face cream, transformed what might otherwise be just another moisturizer into a scientific intervention, a product whose benefits operated at a level of biological sophistication beneath the threshold of ordinary sensory perception. This was sophisticated manipulation, but it was not straightforward fraud. Many of the women who used Dorothy Gray products in the 1950s genuinely believed their skin was improving, and some of the improvement was real, not because estrogen applied topically to the skin was delivering on the cellular regeneration promises the copy implied, but because well-formulated emollients genuinely do improve the appearance of skin dehydration, and because the ritual of careful application, the twice-daily attention to one's own face, had benefits that operated through pathways that cosmetic science of the period had not yet mapped. The placebo component of cosmetic efficacy is not a cynical observation. It is a genuine and interesting phenomenon that mid-century brands exploited with varying degrees of deliberateness. The Dorothy Gray advertising of the 1950s appeared primarily in the more elevated women's magazines, Harper's Bazaar, Vogue, and Town and Country, rather than Good Housekeeping or Ladies' Home Journal, though the brand maintained a presence across the spectrum. The visual language of the advertisements was gentler and more pastel-toned than Revlon's high-contrast theatrical imagery, reflecting a different aspiration. Not the vivid self-assertion of the woman who wears fire and ice, but the quiet confidence of the woman who has always known how to take care of herself. The models in Dorothy Gray advertisements were typically shown in domestic or social settings, at a dressing table, at luncheon, in a garden, rather than the more charged or spectacular scenarios that colour-focused advertising favoured. The implicit argument was about continuity and refinement rather than transformation. What Dorothy Gray offered its customers, ultimately, was membership in a community of women who understood that beauty maintenance was a form of self-respect, and that self-respect had a specific material vocabulary, the right products, purchased at the right counter, applied with the right knowledge. The brand's prestige was inseparable from the experience of its purchase, from the moment a woman seated herself on the upholstered stool at the glass counter and invited an expert's consideration of her face. That experience was not available at a drugstore. It required the department store, the consultant, the deliberate theatre of the cosmetic space. In a decade when department stores were genuine cultural institutions in American civic life, when a trip downtown to shop was a social event with its own costumes and protocols, Dorothy Gray's dependence on that institutional context was a strength rather than a vulnerability. The brand's decline in later decades, as department store culture declined and the drugstore beauty aisle expanded, was in some ways a direct consequence of its deep integration with a particular retail environment. When the altar moved, the ritual had to find a new home. The specific address of a Dorothy Gray salon in a major American city in the early 1950s was a location with social meanings that extended considerably beyond its function as a retail and treatment space. To say that you had an appointment at Dorothy Gray was to make a statement about the category of woman you considered yourself to be. Not the category of wealth, precisely, though the brand's pricing was comfortably above the mass market, but the category of care, of the woman who understood that maintaining her appearance was a form of ongoing professional and social investment, rather than a one-time beauty decision. The appointment itself, with its connotations of scheduled professional attention, distinguished the Dorothy Gray client from the woman who purchased her cosmetics impulsively at a drugstore counter and applied them according to her own untutored judgment. The treatment menu that Dorothy Gray salons offered in the mid-century period reflected a conception of skincare that was simultaneously more clinical and more indulgent than either the department store counter consultation or the home routine could provide. Facial treatments combining cleansing, steam, extraction, and the application of specialized preparations occupied the core of the service menu, supplemented by treatments targeting specific concerns: the dry patches of central heated winter skin, the sun damage that post-war women were only beginning to recognize as a long-term consequence of recreational outdoor activity, the general loss of tone that the brand's advertising attributed, with the scientific vagueness characteristic of the period, to diminishing cellular vitality. The duration of a typical facial treatment, an hour or more in a private treatment room, attended by a trained esthetician, made the experience qualitatively different from any product application a woman could administer at home, and the results, whether or not they exceeded what the home products alone could have achieved, felt categorically distinct, because the experience surrounding them was categorically distinct. Dorothy Gray's product range occupied an interesting intermediate position in the mid-century cosmetic taxonomy. The brand was not Revlon. It did not traffic in theatrical colour claims or fashion-forward shade stories. It was not Helena Rubinstein. It did not build its authority around scientific credentials that required a sophisticated consumer to evaluate. It was not Elizabeth Arden. It did not have the salon heritage and the spa culture that positioned Arden as a complete lifestyle system. Dorothy Gray was something more like the intelligent woman's choice of skincare brand. Not the most glamorous option, not the most scientifically imposing, but rigorously competent, reliably performing, and presented with a taste level that avoided the excess of some competitors and the austerity of others. The advertising visual language that Dorothy Gray employed throughout the 1950s was distinctive in the mid-century cosmetic landscape for its relatively restrained palette and its preference for interior domestic settings over the aspirational theatrical scenarios that Revlon and some other brands favoured. The women in Dorothy Gray advertisements were shown in carefully appointed rooms, the suggestion of a well-furnished home, a well-tended garden, the kind of background detail that communicated taste and social stability without demanding the attention of the product the model was using. The model herself was typically a specific archetype, handsome rather than spectacular, groomed to a level of careful understatement. The kind of woman who looks as though she had not tried particularly hard to look as well as she does. This was an enormously skilled photographic and styling achievement, because the appearance of effortlessness in a mid-century woman's appearance required considerable effort to produce, and the Dorothy Gray brand was implicitly claiming credit for the effortlessness, while acknowledging the effort only in the product being advertised. The company's history with the regulatory environment of the Federal Trade Commission during the 1950s reveals a brand navigating the narrowing space for cosmetic efficacy claims with more sophistication than some competitors, but not without friction. The hormone cream line, those preparations that promise cellular regeneration through topical estrogen application, came under increasing scrutiny as the FTC began to focus more closely on the biological claims that cosmetic companies had been making with relative impunity since the 1930s. Dorothy Gray, like other brands in the premium skincare segment, was required to moderate its most ambitious claims, moving from direct assertions of cellular youth restoration toward more qualified language about appearance improvement and skin feel enhancement. This regulatory pressure was, in historical retrospect, entirely appropriate. The cellular regeneration claims being made for hormone creams were not supportable by the science available at the time, but from the perspective of the brand at the moment of adjustment, the constraint represented a real loss of the specific kind of authority that medical adjacent language had provided. The department store real estate wars of the 1950s were a genuine competitive phenomenon in American retail, and Dorothy Gray was one of the brands actively fighting for favourable positioning on the cosmetic floor. Counter-location mattered enormously. The first counter encountered upon entering the cosmetic floor captured a disproportionate share of the foot traffic that translated into sales, and the cosmetic buyers for major department store chains wielded this knowledge as leverage in their negotiations with cosmetic companies over everything from counter design to promotional spending commitments. Dorothy Gray, positioned as it was between the drugstore mass brand and the absolute premium tier, occupied a middle ground in these negotiations that gave it reasonable, but not unconditional access to premium floor positioning. The brand maintained its presence in the department stores that anchored its retail strategy, while accepting that the corner positions near the main entrance were typically claimed by brands with either higher margin or more aggressive promotional spending. The question of what happened to women who had organised their beauty routines around Dorothy Gray, when the brand's department store footprint contracted in later decades, is not simply a commercial question about brand loyalty and retail transition. It is a question about the social and personal infrastructure that cosmetic brands provided in a period when the ritual of the beauty counter was a genuine feature of women's social lives. The Dorothy Gray customer who had shopped a particular counter for a decade, been advised by a particular consultant, organised her skincare routine around a particular product sequence, did not simply transfer her habits to another brand when her store discontinued the counter. She experienced a small but real disruption in the daily practice that had given structure to a part of her private life. That disruption mattered. It tells us something true about the depth of the relationship mid-century women formed with the cosmetic brands they trusted. Helena Rubinstein did not like to give her age. She did not like to give her place of birth, her real name, the names of her husbands, or the chemical compositions of her product formulations. She gave none of these things willingly, and the biographical fog she maintained around herself throughout her 7 decades in the beauty industry was not the vanity of a private person, but the deliberate architecture of a public myth. Rubinstein understood, with a clarity unusual even among the extraordinary cast of self-invented entrepreneurs who shaped mid-century American commerce, that the founder's story was inseparable from the brand's authority, and that the founder's authority rested on the appearance of knowledge so vast and so specialized that it had no need of ordinary verification. The woman who would become Helena Rubinstein was born Kasia Rubinstein in Krakow, then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, in 1872, though she spent decades claiming birthdays closer to 1880 and would rage at journalists who attempted to nail down the actual date. She emigrated to Australia in 1896, where she opened her first beauty salon in Melbourne in 1902, building a business around a face cream formulation she claimed to have brought from Europe, a preparation attributed, depending on which version of the story she was telling, to a Dr. Likoski of Hungary, or to her family's private receipts, or to the distilled wisdom of European skin science accumulated over generations. The story changed. The face cream did not, and the face cream worked. By the time Rubinstein established her American operations in New York in 1915, she had already built salons in London and Paris, and had accumulated enough capital and institutional credibility to enter the American market not as a newcomer, but as the bearer of established European authority. This was a genuinely important strategic decision. The American beauty consumer of the 19-teens and 20s regarded European expertise in matters of grooming and aesthetics with a reverence that bordered on the metaphysical, and Rubinstein's European salons gave her a credential that no amount of advertising could have manufactured. She was not selling American products to American women. She was translating the secrets of European beauty science for an audience that was already convinced of its superiority. Throughout the 1930s and 40s, Rubinstein built a corporate empire of considerable complexity. Manufacturing facilities, salon operations, wholesale distribution, a packaging and design program that engaged modernist European artists and produced some of the most visually sophisticated cosmetic packaging of the period. The Helena Rubinstein product range was organized around the concept of skin analysis. Before a client purchased anything, she was assessed. Her skin type was classified. Her specific conditions, dryness, oiliness, sensitivity, premature aging, were diagnosed by a consultant trained in the brand's proprietary classification system. The resulting purchase was not an impulse or an aspiration. It was, within the Helena Rubinstein symbolic system, a prescription. This medical framing was not unique to Helena Rubinstein. Elizabeth Arden employed a similar vocabulary, and Dorothy Gray's hormone cream line drew on adjacent language, but Rubinstein pursued it with particular tenacity and invested more heavily in the scientific infrastructure that could support the claim. She maintained a genuine laboratory. She employed trained chemists. She attended scientific conferences and cultivated relationships with dermatologists. The boundary between these activities and the promotional claims she made for her products was often indistinct, but the underlying investment in actual technical knowledge was real and gave the brand a certain depth of authority that purely theatrical competitors could not match on closer examination. The Rubinstein product range that was available at department store counters throughout the 1950s was extensive and organized with almost taxonomic rigor. The skincare line covered different formulations for each classified skin type, with separate preparations for morning and evening use. Color cosmetics, lipstick, rouge, eyeshadow, and the increasingly important eye products that the decade's makeup aesthetic required were organized by what Rubinstein called face fashion principles, a color harmony system that grouped shades by the overall complexion type they best suited. This organizational logic was itself a form of brand communication. It suggested that the brand possessed a systematic understanding of beauty that transcended individual products and constituted something closer to a comprehensive science. Rubinstein's personal celebrity, which she maintained with calculated energy into her 80s, was an important component of the brand's authority throughout this period. She was a genuine public figure, not simply a businesswoman, but a collector of art, a society presence, a woman whose opinions on matters extending well beyond cosmetics were solicited by journalists and broadcast to audiences who found her combination of immigrant ambition, European cultural sophistication, and commercial ruthlessness genuinely compelling. Profiles in major magazines described her New York apartment, which she filled with surrealist paintings and African sculpture, in the same breath as they described her latest product innovation. The apartment was itself a brand communication. It said that Helena Rubinstein was not merely in the beauty business, but was a person of genuine culture and broad intellectual appetite, someone whose judgment about the surface of a woman's face was connected to a deeper sensibility about beauty in all its manifestations. Her rivalry with Elizabeth Arden, which became one of American commerce's more productively antagonistic relationships, deserves mention because it shaped the mid-century premium beauty market in ways that redounded to both women's advantage. They competed for the same department store positioning, the same clientele, the same magazine advertising pages. They refused to speak each other's names directly. Arden referred to Rubinstein as "that woman," and Rubinstein reciprocated the gesture with variations of similar contempt. The competition produced better products, more refined marketing, and a continuous escalation of the perceived prestige of both brands that made the premium beauty segment overall more valuable. Neither woman was entirely wrong about the other. Arden was more elegant, more colour-restricted, more disciplined in her brand voice. Rubinstein was more scientifically grounded, more visually adventurous, more willing to engage with complexity and contradiction. Both were right about their customers. Women who could afford the premium tier wanted to believe that their skincare routine was something more than habit. The trust that Helena Rubinstein commanded in the 1950s was of a specific and unusual character. It was the trust extended to expertise so comprehensively performed that its verification became almost beside the point. The women who visited Helena Rubinstein counters and submitted to the brand's skin analysis procedures were not checking credentials. They were participating in a ritual that confirmed, by its very structure, that knowledge of the kind required had been acquired and was available. The ritual was real. The knowledge, imperfect as all scientific knowledge was in that period, was also real. The trust was earned. The fact that it was earned through performance as much as through proof does not diminish it. It simply describes accurately how trust operates in markets where technical information is inaccessible to the ordinary consumer. Helena Rubinstein understood this and built an empire on it. The art collection that Helena Rubinstein assembled over the course of her long career in the beauty business was not incidental to her brand identity, but constitutive of it, in ways that the simple biographical fact of her collecting fails to capture. Rubinstein was among the earliest serious collectors of African art in the American context, acquiring pieces that later formed the basis of serious museum collections, and she maintained an active relationship with the Surrealist circle in Paris during the movement's formative decades. Salvador Dali designed a famous sofa for her in the shape of Mae West's lips, an object that collapsed the distance between fine art and beauty culture with a wit that Rubinstein clearly appreciated. The apartment she maintained on Park Avenue in New York, which she furnished over decades with surrealist paintings, ancient art, modern sculpture, and objects of ethnographic interest from every inhabited continent, became a well-known social environment that attracted artists, intellectuals, and the culturally ambitious with a kind of irregular regularity that made it both exclusive and genuinely interesting. The brand intelligence of this cultural positioning was considerable, even if Rubinstein's collecting reflected genuine aesthetic appetite rather than purely strategic calculation. A woman who surrounds herself with great art, who participates in the intellectual conversations of the avant-garde, who treats African and pre-Columbian objects with the same seriousness she brings to European modernism, is implicitly making a claim about the breadth and quality of her visual intelligence. And a woman whose visual intelligence is this broad and this serious is, by extension, someone whose opinions about the surface of a woman's face deserve a particular kind of weight. The connection is indirect but powerful. If Helena Rubinstein understands beauty at the level of world art, her understanding of beauty at the level of skin preparation and cosmetic colour is likely to be correspondingly sophisticated. This was not a logical argument. It was a cultural argument, which meant it operated below the threshold of deliberate evaluation and worked on the consumer's imagination rather than on her analytical faculties. The research laboratory that Rubinstein maintained at her manufacturing facility was not purely a marketing prop, though it served a marketing function. The company did employ chemists. It did conduct formulation research. It did, within the considerable limitations of cosmetic science in the 1950s, attempt to develop products whose performance claims were connected to some genuine technological basis. The Youth Dew preparations, a name used across the Helena Rubinstein line for products claiming to improve the appearance of aging skin, were built on formulations that included significant concentrations of emollient ingredients with genuine barrier-protecting and moisture-retaining properties, supplemented by the hormonal and vitamin-rich preparations that the period's cosmetic science invested with therapeutic ambitions the regulatory environment would later require to be moderated. The specific claims made for these preparations, the cellular regeneration language, the suggestions of genuine biological intervention in the aging process, exceeded what the science could support. But beneath the promotional exaggeration were real products with real formulation quality, and women who used them were not being deceived about everything. The global reach of Helena Rubinstein's operation in the 1950s set the brand apart from many American cosmetic companies that were still primarily domestically focused. Rubinstein had built her salon network in London and Paris before establishing her American presence, and she maintained and expanded the European operations throughout the mid-century period with the particular confidence of an entrepreneur who had built an international enterprise before building an American one, rather than the reverse. The European salon served a different clientele with somewhat different beauty traditions and different product formulation expectations. the French consumer's relationship with fragrance and skincare operated within a cultural context that had its own highly evolved standards. And navigating these differences required Rubinstein to maintain a level of product development and marketing sophistication that a purely domestic brand would not have needed to develop. The labour practices at Helena Rubinstein's salons in the 1950s reflected the particular dynamics of a service business built around the specialised knowledge and physical proximity of skilled practitioners. The aestheticians who performed facial treatments, the beauty consultants who advised clients on product selection, the hairstylists who worked in the salon's hair care division, were each bringing a specific expertise to a labour arrangement that made them simultaneously craftspeople and service workers in the mid-century American economy's not always comfortable category of personal service employment. Rubinstein herself was not known for exceptional generosity as an employer. The biographical record suggests she was exacting, occasionally capricious, and not inclined to sentimentalize the relationship between her business and the people who worked in it. But the brand's commitment to training its employees thoroughly was genuine, because the quality of the consumer's experience depended entirely on the quality of the human beings who delivered it, and Rubinstein understood this connection with the clarity of someone who had spent 50 years building customer relationships in the most direct form available to a service business. The succession crisis that the Helena Rubinstein organization faced in the years following the founder's death in 1966 was a direct consequence of the degree to which the brand's authority had been concentrated in the founder's person, rather than distributed across institutional structures that could survive her. Rubinstein had not cultivated a management successor in any systematic way. She was constitutionally unsuited to sharing authority, and the idea of training someone to replace her, which would have required acknowledging that she was replaceable, was not one she pursued with any evident urgency. The result was that when she died, at what was certainly over 90 years of age, the brand's competitive differentiation was substantially orphaned. The products were good, the salon network was real, the retail distribution was established. But the animating intelligence that had connected all of these elements into a coherent brand proposition, the voice, the authority, the very particular cultural claim of the woman who had studied with European dermatologists and collected African sculpture and formulated face cream for 50 years, was gone, and it could not be replaced by a management team however capable, because it had never been an institutional property. It had been a person's property, and the person was gone. The most expensive sentence in the history of American cosmetic advertising may have been the 4 words that Coty placed at the bottom of nearly every print advertisement it ran between the 1920s and the 1950s, a Coty creation, Paris. Those 4 words did not simply indicate geographic origin. They functioned as a passport, a visa stamp confirming that the product bearing them had cleared some invisible border between ordinary American commerce and the rarefied atmosphere of French aesthetic authority, that the Coty Corporation was, by the 1950s, a thoroughly American enterprise with manufacturing facilities in New Jersey and a corporate headquarters in New York did not complicate this claim in any way that mattered to consumers. Paris was not a place in these advertisements, it was a quality. François Coty, the Corsican-born perfumer who founded the company in Paris in 1904, was a genuine revolutionary in the fragrance industry. He understood that perfume had been priced and packaged for the wealthy since its commercial inception, and he set about changing both the economics and the aesthetic of scent with a deliberateness that the French establishment found initially alarming. His fragrances were technically innovative. He worked closely with the Baccarat Glassworks and with designer René Lalique to create bottles whose beauty was inseparable from the experience of the scent and commercially brilliant. By pricing Coty perfumes below the luxury barrier while maintaining the visual vocabulary of genuine luxury, he created the mass prestige category that defines most of the global fragrance market to this day. The American Coty operation, which became increasingly independent of the French founding enterprise as the century progressed, translated this original democratizing impulse into a full cosmetic line that by the post-war decade covered lipstick, face powder, foundation, rouge, and the full range of preparations a mid-century woman's makeup routine required. The Coty Air-Spun Face Powder, a loose powder formulation that had been on the market in various iterations since the 1930s, was by the early 1950s one of the most consistently selling cosmetic products in the American drugstore. Its characteristic round box with the golden stenciled script and the satin finish lid was a presence on bathroom shelves across every income bracket, a product that was recognisably Coty, recognisably touched by the French reputation, but priced within the reach of any household that had a discretionary cosmetic budget at all. The air-spun powder's technical construction was elegantly simple and genuinely effective. The formula combined fine-milled talc as the base with a significant proportion of cornstarch, which gave the powder a particular softness and light absorbency that worked well with the foundation formulations and lighting conditions of the period. The pigment system was designed to provide subtle colour correction while remaining transparent enough not to change the underlying shade of foundation noticeably. It was setting and skin tone refining rather than covering. The packaging's metal container with the sifter screen kept the powder from oxidizing or becoming contaminated in the way that open pots could. These were genuine technical virtues, and the product's longevity in the market, Air-Spun face powder is still sold in recognizable form today, reflects the underlying quality of the formulation, rather than simply the strength of nostalgic loyalty. The Coty lipstick line of the 1950s operated on an interesting dual strategy. The brand offered a premium lipstick tier, packaged in the gold-toned tubes with the French script branding that signalled the Paris inheritance, and a more accessible entry point that competed directly with the drugstore brands on price while maintaining the Coty name's aspirational associations. The shade naming convention followed a modified version of the romantic French vocabulary approach. Colours were named after Paris neighbourhoods, French words for flowers and seasons, or the kind of aristocratic-sounding associations that implied their bearer was at ease with European cultural references. This was neither as bold nor as psychologically complex as Revlon's colour-naming philosophy, but it served the brand's specific positioning. Not transformation, not confrontation, but a smooth, untroubling elegance available to any woman who chose to reach for it. The perfume heritage was always the deepest and most emotionally resonant part of the Coty brand identity, and the company's cosmetic line benefited from the halo effect of fragrance in ways that were real but difficult to quantify precisely. Coty's Le Mans, one of several fragrances in the company's mid-century portfolio, was among the best-selling perfumes in America throughout the 1950s, and the women who wore it inhabited an olfactory relationship with the Coty brand that was qualitatively different from the visual relationship established through makeup purchases. Fragrance operates on a more involuntary and emotionally direct register than colour cosmetics. You do not choose to encounter a scent the way you choose to look at a lipstick shade. And the woman who associated Le Mans's warm floral signature with particular memories of social success or romantic attention was likely to extend the emotional associations of that fragrance to the brand's lipstick and powder, almost without being consciously aware of doing so. This fragrance to cosmetics brand transfer was not unique to Coty. Both Revlon and Helena Rubinstein made deliberate connections between their fragrance and cosmetic lines, and the major fashion houses that were beginning to extend into cosmetics in this period, Chanel, Lanvin, Balenciaga, built their entire cosmetic credibility on the established authority of their perfume identities. But Coty had a particular advantage in this territory, because the brand's fragrance heritage was both genuine and accessible, not the exclusive luxury of a haute couture house, but the kind of semi-aspirational French elegance that the post-war American middle class was actively reaching toward as it built its suburban prosperity. The geography of Coty's distribution in the 1950s traced the brand's democratic aspirations more accurately than any advertising claim could have. Coty products were in Woolworths and in Saks Fifth Avenue, in the campus drugstores of Midwestern universities, and in the cosmetic departments of downtown Manhattan department stores. They were in the medicine cabinets of secretaries and the vanity drawers of socialites. This span was not accidental and was not easily maintained. The retail environment of the period had strong social stratification, and a brand that appeared in Woolworths risked losing the associations that made it desirable in department stores. Coty navigated this tension by maintaining absolute consistency of visual identity and quality across every distribution point. The airspun powder box looked the same at every counter. The lipstick tube was the same tube. The product was the same product. The stratified retail environment sorted itself without any help from Coty. The brand simply showed up everywhere, with consistent quality and consistent identity, and let each customer find it in whatever context suited her. The trust that Coty accumulated through this consistent ubiquity was a different species from the trust earned by more exclusive brands. It was not the trust of the initiated, the trust of the consumer who has access to something others cannot reach. It was the trust of the reliable, the trust of the brand that keeps showing up in whatever form the woman needs it, at whatever price she can afford, without requiring her to perform an aspiration she may not feel. In the mid-century American beauty market, which was navigating the extraordinary social mobility of the post-war boom and the complicated questions of taste and class that mobility raised, Coty's democratic accessibility was not a failure to achieve exclusivity. It was an alternative relationship with the market, and one that proved, across several decades, more sustainable than many more overtly aspirational competitors. The role of fragrance in building and sustaining brand loyalty within the Coty portfolio deserves more analytical attention than the transactional history of the company's cosmetic products typically receives. Perfume operates on the olfactory system through pathways that are neurologically distinct from those through which visual brand signals, the packaging, the counter display, the advertising image, work on the consumer's perception. The olfactory bulb is among the most phylogenetically ancient parts of the human brain, and its connections to the limbic system, the emotional memory architecture, are both more direct and less susceptible to conscious mediation than the connections from visual or auditory perception. This means that a fragrance a woman associates with a particular experience, mood, or period of her life has a persistence and emotional charge in memory that a product's visual identity, however distinctive, cannot easily match. For the Coty customer of the 1950s, the fragrance association worked in multiple directions simultaneously. A woman who wore Le Mans and associated its warm, floral, musky signature with a specific evening's social success, a dinner where she had felt beautiful and confident, a meeting that had gone well, a compliment received from someone whose opinion she valued, was likely to reach for Le Mans again when she wished to inhabit that quality of confidence. And because Le Mans occupied the same brand space as Coty's powder and lipstick, because the name Coty was present on both the fragrance that carried the emotional memory and the cosmetic products she saw at the drugstore counter, the brand accumulated an olfactory as well as a visual presence in her sensory vocabulary. This was not a uniquely Coty phenomenon. All brands with both fragrance and cosmetic lines benefit from this cross-modal brand association. But Coty's particular combination of fragrance heritage and cosmetic accessibility gave the mechanism unusual scope, reaching women whose primary entry to the brand might be either the fragrance or the powder, and providing a route to the other from either direction. The corporate history of the American Coty organization in the 1950s was less glamorous than the brand's French origin mythology implied. The company was publicly traded by mid-decade, subject to the ordinary disciplines of shareholder accountability that tended to accelerate the drift toward cost optimization and away from the kind of idiosyncratic investment in quality and presentation that characterized the founding generation's approach to brand building. The original François Coty had been willing to commission Baccarat and Lalique for his packaging because he understood that the container was inseparable from the scent it contained. that the first experience of a perfume was tactile and visual as well as olfactory. The publicly traded American company of the 1950s was subject to pressures that made this level of packaging investment harder to maintain systematically, even as the marketing materials continued to invoke the original aesthetic ambition. The air-spun face powder's phenomenal durability as a commercial product, it outsold virtually every competitor throughout the 1950s and continues to sell in recognizable form today, reflects a set of product virtues that transcended whatever marketing was spent behind it at any given moment. The formula worked. The packaging protected it. The price was accessible without being cheap. The talc and cornstarch base gave a finish that worked particularly well with the foundations of the period. The pancake and cream formulations that tended toward a certain blankness of finish without powder's light diffusing contribution. Women who found the airspun formula did not typically abandon it when a competitor launched a new setting powder with more elaborate claims, because the airspun formula was addressing their actual experience with consistent accuracy, and there was no obvious deficit that a more expensive or theoretically sophisticated alternative could promise to fill. The export business that Coty maintained throughout the 1950s extended the brand's democratizing philosophy into markets with very different cosmetic traditions and consumer economic profiles. In Latin American markets, where the mid-century expansion of a cosmetics-aware middle class was proceeding rapidly, the Coty brand's combination of French ancestry prestige and accessible pricing made it particularly well suited to a consumer who was reaching for something that felt aspirationally European without the prohibitive cost of genuine European luxury brands. In Asian markets, where the company maintained distribution relationships through local agents, the brand required more substantial adaptation, different fragrance profiles, different foundation shades, different textures suited to different skin types and climate conditions, that pushed the American corporate management toward a more genuinely international product development orientation than it might otherwise have developed. The result was a Coty brand that was, by the late 1950s, more locally responsive in its international markets than its domestic American presentation typically required it to be. The question of what Coty offered the mid-century woman that she could not find elsewhere at comparable prices is ultimately a question about the specific quality of the aspiration the brand enabled. Mass-market cosmetic brands of the period offered products that worked. The Maybelline mascara, the Tangy lipstick, the Revlon drugstore line. But that did not carry the particular kind of cultural freight that Coty's French association provided. The Coty customer was purchasing not simply a cosmetic product but a very specific cultural claim. That the sensibility behind the product, the taste that had organized its color and fragrance and presentation, was continuous with the tradition that had given the world Chanel and Lanvin and the whole apparatus of French aesthetic authority that post-war American culture regarded with particular reverence. Whether or not this claim was literally true in any rigorous sense, and by the 1950s the American Coty operation was substantially autonomous from anything that could fairly be called a living French cosmetic tradition, the cultural meaning of the claim was real and produced real effects in the consumer's relationship with the product. Paris was not in the jar, but the word Paris, and everything the word carried, was on the label, the red door that Florence Nightingale Graham, who had changed her name to Elizabeth Arden before she became famous enough for the name to mean anything, painted on the entrance to her first New York salon on Fifth Avenue in 1910 was not a decorative choice, it was a manifesto. The door said in the particular language of colour and threshold that anyone who has ever approached a closed door and wondered what lay behind it will understand immediately. What is inside here is different from what is outside. What is inside here is curated, controlled, and specifically for you. To enter is to leave the ordinary world and occupy, for as long as your appointment permits, a version of feminine existence that has been carefully elevated above the quotidian. By the 1950s, the Red Door had become one of the most potent brand signifiers in American commerce, Arden had built her salon network into a genuine institution, with locations in New York, Boston, Washington, Chicago, and major cities throughout the country, and had extended the Red Door philosophy into a product line that attempted to bring the salon experience into the home through the medium of her package preparations. The products were expensive. The packaging was beautiful in a restrained, understated way that communicated taste rather than display. The shade palette for Arden's lipstick and colour cosmetics leaned toward the clear, clean pinks and reds that suited fair Northern European skin types, a reflection, critics occasionally noted, of Arden's own complexion preferences and somewhat narrow conception of beauty's colour range. Elizabeth Arden, the woman, and Elizabeth Arden, the brand, were unusually difficult to separate throughout the company's mid-century history. Unlike Revson, who built Revlon as an explicitly commercial enterprise organised around marketing insights rather than personal aesthetic vision, or the Coty heirs, who maintained the founding mythology while operating an essentially impersonal corporate enterprise, Arden remained genuinely, sometimes exhaustingly involved in the product development, the salon operations, and the marketing communication of the company she had built. She had opinions about lipstick shades, with the same intensity she had opinions about horse racing. The other great consuming passion of her life, which she pursued through the Maine Chance Farm horse breeding operation that produced several Kentucky Derby contenders during the decade. The 8-hour cream was the centerpiece of the Arden product mythology throughout the 50s and remains so today in the brand's contemporary product lineup. Developed in the 1930s as a multi-purpose skin preparation, usable as a moisturizer, as a healing treatment for minor skin irritations, as a lip treatment, as a conditioning preparation for cuticles and dry spots on elbows and hands, it occupied a category that was still relatively uncrowded in the mid-century cosmetic landscape. The product that did several things well rather than one thing with brand-specific specialization. The formula was built around petrolatum as its primary occlusive ingredient, which gave it extraordinary skin barrier protecting capacity, supplemented with salicylic acid for its mild exfoliating and anti-inflammatory properties. The characteristic amber colour and slightly sweet, clean fragrance were functional signatures that became, over decades, emotionally significant to the women who used the product habitually. Arden's relationship with the fashion world was deeper and more genuinely integrated than most of her cosmetic competitors managed to achieve. She had understood early in her career that the face and the wardrobe were not separate departments of feminine presentation, but aspects of a single visual argument, and she cultivated relationships with the major American fashion designers of the post-war period, Norman Norell, Maine Bochet, later Bill Blass, that allowed the brand to speak with authentic authority about colour coordination, seasonal palette shifts, and the way a woman's makeup should relate to the tonalities of her clothes. This integration was not merely conceptual. Arden's consultants in the salons were trained to assess a client's wardrobe colorways alongside her skin type when making product recommendations, treating the dressed and undressed self as dimensions of the same presentation rather than separate problems with separate solutions. The Maine Chance Spa, Arden's residential beauty resort operation, which she opened in Phoenix, Arizona in the 1940s and which became a significant enterprise through the 50s, extended the Red Door philosophy to its furthest logical conclusion: a complete environment, total immersion, every variable of a woman's daily existence curated toward an ideal of health, beauty, and quiet luxury. Guests at Maine Chance underwent daily exercise regimens, dietary programs, beauty treatments, and consultations with dermatological and fitness specialists in a setting that combined luxury resort amenities with the moral seriousness of genuine health improvement. The women who attended, political wives, society figures, the occasionally celebrity, were not simply on vacation. They were undertaking within the Arden symbolic system a rigorous project of self-maintenance that required the kind of exclusive, concentrated environment that ordinary life could not provide. This extreme version of the brand's philosophy illuminates something important about the trust that Arden commanded among its core clientele. The women who committed to main chants, who spent 2 weeks under Arden's dietary and beauty regimen, were expressing a faith not in a product, but in a complete epistemology of femininity, a comprehensive system for the management of appearance and health that extended from the daily moisturizer in the morning to the sleep mask at night, from the choice of foundation shade to the number of calories consumed at lunch. Arden had built a world, and the women who trusted her trusted the whole world, not just the individual products that were the world's most visible elements. The competitive relationship between Arden and Rubinstein was the dominant drama of the premium beauty market throughout the decade, and its implications shaped both brands in interesting ways. Arden responded to Rubinstein's scientific authority by deepening her own engagement with clinical legitimacy, adding trained dermatologists to her salon staff, investing in skin analysis equipment, commissioning independent research into the efficacy of her formulations. Rubinstein responded to Arden's fashion authority by cultivating her own relationships with couture houses and refining the aesthetic presentation of her products. The result was that both brands, in competition, became more comprehensive and more sophisticated than either would likely have become in isolation. The customer benefited from the rivalry's productive anxieties. The trust Elizabeth Arden commanded was the trust of total commitment, the confidence a woman places in a system rather than a product, in a comprehensive vision of what she could look and feel like if she followed the discipline the brand prescribed. This kind of trust is both the strongest and the most fragile kind available to a brand. It is the strongest because it reaches into the customer's daily life and becomes inseparable from her sense of self. It is the most fragile because it depends on the brand's vision remaining consistent, authoritative, and genuinely connected to the values that originally organized it. When Arden died in 1966 and the company passed through various ownership transitions, the Red Door remained. But the singular, slightly autocratic personal authority that had given it meaning took considerably longer to replace. The exercise philosophy that Elizabeth Arden embedded in her main chant spa operations was far ahead of the broader fitness culture that would not emerge as a mainstream American preoccupation until the 1970s and beyond. The daily movement regimen that spa guests followed, a combination of what would now be recognized as light resistance training, stretching practices with strong resemblances to early Pilates methodology, and aerobic walking in the carefully landscaped grounds of the Phoenix property, was based on Arden's genuine conviction that physical conditioning and cosmetic maintenance were not separate disciplines, but aspects of a single project of bodily management. The woman who exercised regularly, who maintained a healthy diet, who slept adequate hours and managed her stress through structured leisure and beauty treatment, would look better and feel better than the woman who addressed only the surface of her face with whatever products her budget permitted. This was not a radical insight, but Arden pursued it with a system-building rigor that few competitors could match, and built it into the physical infrastructure of a retreat environment that made the philosophy experiential rather than merely theoretical. The dietary component of the main chants program reflected the mid-century understanding of nutrition that was considerably less sophisticated than contemporary nutritional science, but genuinely more attentive to the relationship between food and appearance than the mainstream food culture of the period typically encouraged. Arden worked with nutritional consultants who developed menus calibrated to the goals of weight management, skin hydration, and general vitality that the spa's clientele sought, using fresh vegetables, lean proteins, and carefully controlled portion sizes in a period when suburban American food culture was moving enthusiastically in the opposite direction, toward frozen convenience foods, high-fat dairy products, and the abundant carbohydrate consumption that the post-war agricultural surplus had made available at low cost. The contrast between the main chance menu and the ordinary American diet of the period was stark, and the guests who experienced the difference often carried some version of the main chance dietary philosophy back into their ordinary lives, which meant that the spa program functioned not only as a concentrated beauty treatment, but as a re-education in daily food choices. The social composition of the main chance clientele during the 1950s reflects both the program's cost, the fees were substantial, and the specific definition of important womanhood that the mid-century social structure produced. Political wives attended. Mamie Eisenhower was among the guests during the decade, a patronage whose publicity value Arden understood perfectly and deployed with characteristic shrewdness. Social figures from major eastern cities made regular visits, treating main chance with a loyalty that resembled the seasonal rhythm of the resort circuit. Occasionally an actress or musician appeared, adding a different kind of celebrity shine to the register. What these women had in common was not simply wealth, though wealth was a prerequisite, but a particular kind of public visibility that made the maintenance of appearance something more than personal preference. They were women whose faces were seen, whose grooming was observed and commented upon, whose physical presentation was understood as a dimension of the public role they occupied. Main chance served their specific need, not merely to be made attractive, but to be systematically optimized for public presentation under a regime comprehensive enough that the optimization could be trusted. The Red Door salon network that operated throughout American cities during the decade varied considerably in size and service range, but maintained a remarkable consistency of visual identity and basic service philosophy. The Red Doors themselves, a specific Arden red, a warm, slightly dark shade the company protected as part of its brand identity, appeared on salon entrances in Washington and Boston and Chicago with the same deliberate uniformity that Arden applied to her product packaging. The consultants who staffed the salons were trained at a central facility and evaluated against common standards that Arden took a personal interest in maintaining. The treatment protocols were standardized to a degree that allowed a regular client of the New York flagship to visit the Boston location and receive a service experience recognizably continuous with what she was accustomed to, which in a period before the franchise systems that make such consistency routine across hospitality brands had been thoroughly developed, was a genuine operational achievement. The colour philosophy that Arden developed and enforced throughout her product line in the 1950s was one of her most distinctive brand signatures, and the aspect of her aesthetic judgment that most clearly reflected her personal taste rather than a broad survey of consumer preference. Arden's lipstick palette leaned toward the clear, clean colours, a specific pink that became known among beauty editors as Arden Pink, various roses and corals that read as cultivated rather than dramatic, and the red she permitted were the blue reds of rose and raspberry rather than the orange reds or brick reds that were also fashionable at mid-decade. The palette communicated restraint, femininity without aggression, and a kind of Anglophone aesthetic conservatism that reflected Arden's admiration for English upper-class grooming standards. Critics occasionally noted that the Arden colour range was implicitly calibrated to a narrow definition of complexion that excluded women of colour by design rather than by oversight. This criticism was accurate, and it points to a significant limitation of the brand's conception of beauty that was common across the premium segment of the industry, but was not universal. Some brands, including Max Factor's professional line, had developed a broader complexion vocabulary through the practical necessity of their Hollywood work. The fragrance work that Elizabeth Arden conducted in parallel with her skincare and colour cosmetics operations produced several scents that achieved genuine commercial and critical success, but none that matched the cultural penetration of the Rubinstein or Coty fragrance portfolios. Bluegrass, Arden's signature fragrance launched in the 1930s and still in production in the 50s, was a fresh, green floral composition that suited the particular version of feminine elegance the brand projected. It smelled of country houses and well-tended gardens, of the kind of understated affluence that announces itself through quality of fabric and propriety of behaviour, rather than through display. It was beautiful without being demanding, and it remained a steady seller throughout the decade among the women whose own aesthetic orientation matched its particular register. In 1923, a chemist working for the George W. Luft Company in New York produced a lipstick that appeared bright orange in the tube and turned a soft, natural pink on application. The mechanism was not magic. It was a bromo acid dye formulation in which a colorant called eosin, which has a naturally orange appearance in concentrated form, bonded to the slight alkalinity of lip tissue and shifted its visual expression to a warm pink or rose, the specific shade depending on the individual wearer's natural lip color. The product was called Tangy, and for the next 3 decades it occupied one of the most psychologically specific niches in the history of American cosmetics, the lipstick that was definitionally appropriate for anyone. The appropriateness was the point and the genius. The 1920s were not innocent about the cultural associations of lipstick. The bright reds and dark berries that fashionable women wore were coded explicitly as daring, as sexually assertive, as the visual shorthand for a particular kind of modern womanhood that not everyone was ready to claim. Tangy offered something different, a lipstick that enhanced rather than declared, that gave the lips colour and definition without the social signalling of a deliberately chosen shade. A woman wearing Tangy was, in a very real sense, wearing her own lips amplified, because the colour she wore was a function of her own body chemistry reacting with the dye. This was, in a market that was simultaneously pushing women toward conspicuous colour choices and judging them for making them, an extraordinarily canny position. The Tangy advertising of the 1920s and 30s leaned hard into this natural quality, with the moralistic fervour of a temperance pamphlet. Copy from that period explicitly contrasted Tangy with the harsh, garish reds of other manufacturers, suggested that men preferred the natural look Tangy created over the painted-on appearance of conventional lipstick, and occasionally went so far as to characterize heavy lipstick wearing as the province of women of uncertain character. This advertising language reads poorly in retrospect. The judgment implicit in the natural versus painted framing was aimed squarely at the women most likely to be judged by exactly such standards. But it was commercially effective within the cultural context it inhabited. Tangy sold enormously well throughout the 20s and 30s, becoming one of the most widely distributed cosmetic brands in the country, and expanding into a full product line including rouge, nail polish, and face powder, organised around the same natural enhancement philosophy. By the 1950s, Tangy's cultural position had shifted considerably. The post-war decade was a period of enthusiastic, even obligatory lipstick wearing. Revlon's theatrical colour philosophy had colonised the aspirational centre of the market, and the idea that a properly groomed woman wore a clearly defined lip colour was so thoroughly normalised that the anti-lipstick moralism of Tangy's early advertising would have seemed almost incomprehensible to a consumer encountering it fresh. Tangy adapted. The advertising softened its natural versus painted framing and moved toward a different set of associations, the idea that Tangy was the intelligent choice, the choice of the woman who understood that makeup was most effective when it appeared not to be makeup at all, when it achieved enhancement rather than transformation. The product continued to sell well, but its market position had changed from revolutionary to nostalgic, or more precisely, to a particular kind of conservative femininity that found the theatrical self-presentation of Revlon advertising somewhat overwhelming, and preferred the implied modesty of a lip colour that worked with rather than against the wearer's natural complexion. This market segment was real and substantial. Not every woman in 1952 wanted to inhabit the charged scenario of fire and ice. Some women wanted to look carefully groomed without looking as though they had tried very hard to look carefully groomed, and Tangy served that desire with a formulation that had been proven across 3 decades of consistent use. The chemistry of Tangy's colour-shifting mechanism was more than just a clever trick. It was a genuine technical innovation that anticipated later developments in what would eventually be called biological cosmetics, or the idea that cosmetic products should work with rather than against the individual wearer's physiology. The Osin dye that drove Tangi's colour shift was, in the vocabulary of later cosmetic science, a pH-reactive colorant, changing its visual behaviour in response to the specific chemical environment of the wearer's skin. Each woman who wore Tangi wore a slightly different colour, not because the formula was inconsistent, but because human biochemistry is individual. This individualization of the cosmetic experience was something that the industry would spend decades trying to engineer through other means. The skin-type matched foundation, the customized shade range, the personalized formulation. Tangi had achieved a version of it in 1923 through a much simpler and more elegant mechanism. The brand's wartime history is worth noting because it illuminates a dimension of Tangi's cultural authority that the peacetime advertising rarely emphasized. During the Second World War, the Women's Army Corps approved Tangi as one of the few cosmetic products that female service members were permitted to use while in uniform, specifically because the subtle, natural-looking colour it produced was consistent with military grooming standards while still meeting the military's requirement that its female personnel maintain a conventionally feminine appearance. This official endorsement, the government stamp in effect of appropriate femininity, was something Tangi's advertising noted with some pride in the immediate post-war years before the cultural moment that made it relevant had passed. The post-war Tangi product range expanded beyond the original lipstick into a more comprehensive cosmetic offering while maintaining the brand's core natural enhancement positioning. The Tangi theatrical line, a slightly more vivid extension of the original formula developed for stage and performance use, was something of a paradox since the theatrical application environment was precisely the high-intensity context in which subtle colour shifts would be least visible to an audience. But the theatrical association gave the brand an interesting kind of authority. The idea that even performers, who worked in a context demanding dramatic visibility, chose Tangi was a somewhat counterintuitive endorsement that the advertising deployed with considerable ingenuity. The trust that women placed in Tangi throughout the 1950s was, at its core, the trust of familiarity. The brand was not exciting in the way Revlon was exciting. It was not scientific in the way Max Factor was scientific. It was not prestigious in the way Helena Rubinstein was prestigious. It was reliable, consistent, and kind to the women who wore it, in the literal sense that it did not demand anything of them that they were not prepared to offer. It did not ask them to be vivid, or transformed, or theatrical. It asked only that they show up as themselves, and it promised to make the version of themselves that appeared afterward look gently, honestly like the best version of that self. In a decade that asked an enormous amount of women in terms of appearance performance and social role compliance, that gentle, undemanding promise was its own form of luxury. The question of what it meant for a lipstick to be natural in 1953 is considerably more complicated than the contemporary use of the word in beauty marketing typically acknowledges. In current usage, natural signals ingredient sourcing, plant-based rather than synthetic, derived from recognizable food or botanical sources rather than from industrial chemical processes. In 1953, natural signaled something quite different. It meant the lipstick looked as though it might not be there, as though the colour on the lips was the colour the woman's lips simply were, slightly amplified, slightly perfected, but not visibly applied. This distinction is important because Tangi's claim to naturalness was entirely a claim about optical effect, rather than about ingredient origin. The eosin dye at the centre of its formula was a synthetic chemical compound with no particular relationship to anything one might find in a garden. And yet the claim was not dishonest, because optical naturalness was genuinely what it delivered. The visual culture of the early 1950s in which Tangi's natural positioning made sense was one in which the boundaries between acceptable and excessive cosmetic use were actively and anxiously policed. Women's magazines of the period carried etiquette guidance about the appropriate degree of visible makeup for different social contexts. The office permitted a certain level, the church a lesser level, the evening dinner party a greater one, and the guidance was articulated with a specificity that reflected how much social anxiety the question of appropriate feminine appearance generated. Too little makeup in most contexts read as either carelessness or poverty. Too much, in most contexts, read as either vulgarity or an attempt to attract attention that was considered inappropriate to the situation. The correct quantity was determined by context, class signals, regional variation, and the individual woman's judgment about her particular social environment, and getting it wrong carried genuine social costs. Within this anxiety-laden landscape of calibrated feminine presentation, Tangy occupied a specific and commercially valuable position. It was the lipstick that could not be excessive because its colour was biologically anchored to the wearer's own physiology. The woman who wore Tangy was, definitionally, within the acceptable range, because the colour she was wearing was a version of her own natural colour, rather than an externally chosen shade that announced its own artificiality. This was a remarkably elegant solution to a pervasive mid-century problem of feminine social navigation, and it explains why the brand maintained strong sales throughout a decade when it was simultaneously being outflanked on the aspirational side by Revlon's theatrical colour philosophy, and on the technical side by Hazel Bishop's longwear innovation. The regional variation in Tangy's sales performance across different parts of the United States in the 1950s reveals interesting cultural geography. The brand performed disproportionately well in the South and in smaller Midwestern cities, communities where the social conservatism around visible cosmetic use was most pronounced, and where the natural appearance claim carried the strongest commercial value. In major metropolitan centres on the east and west coasts, where fashion culture moved faster and the theatrical self-presentation that Revlon's advertising promoted found more receptive audiences, Tangy held a smaller share of a larger market. This geographic distribution was not simply a function of demographics or income. It reflected actual differences in the social norms around feminine appearance that different regional cultures maintained with considerable conviction through the 1950s. The marketing team that Tangy employed through the George W. Luft Company's management of the brand in this period was working within a positioning that offered both significant strengths and significant constraints. The natural enhancement story was genuinely differentiating and genuinely resonant with a specific consumer segment. But it was also a story that struggled to evolve with the seasonal rhythm of cosmetic marketing that the industry's competitive dynamics required. Revlon could announce a new colour story every season, building excitement and driving trial purchase with the same basic mechanism that fashion houses used to generate enthusiasm for each new collection. Tangy's fundamental proposition, "Our colour is your colour, only better," was not a story that generated new seasonal enthusiasm in the same way, because the product's defining characteristic was its consistency rather than its novelty. The response to this constraint was a product line extension strategy that attempted to bring Tangy's colour-shifting chemistry into adjacent categories while expanding the range of contexts in which the brand's natural enhancement story could be told. Tangy expanded into rouge products, organised around the same colour-adapting chemistry. Preparations that shifted from their container colour to a natural flush on the cheek, avoiding the harsh line of demarcation that poorly applied rouge of the period could produce. The nail polish line, which launched without the colour-shifting chemistry because the mechanism was not applicable to nail lacquer formulation, carried the Tangy name but relied on the brand's naturalness association to imply a similar philosophy of enhancement without excess. These extensions maintained the brand's revenue base, while the core lipstick product held its position against increasing competition from the longwear formulations that other manufacturers had developed in response to Hazel Bishop's market disruption. The women who remained loyal to Tangy throughout the 1950s and into the 60s were, in many cases, making a choice that reflected something deeper than preference for a particular shade or formula type. They were choosing a relationship with cosmetics that prioritized comfort over transformation, that valued the confirmation of existing attractiveness over the promise of a different kind of beauty that approached the daily ritual of lipstick application as a small domestic discipline rather than a significant act of self-assertion. This is not a lesser choice. It reflects a specific and coherent set of values about what cosmetics are for and what the experience of wearing them should feel like, and those values were held by a substantial portion of the mid-century American female population with considerable conviction. Tangi's commercial achievement was in building and maintaining a product that served those values with complete accuracy across more than 4 decades of market presence, through the theatrical ambitions of the Revlon era and the technical disruptions of the longwear era, without losing clarity about what it was and for whom. There is a woman who no longer exists. She is not dead exactly. She lives on in the particular configuration of memory that mid-century women carry about their mothers and grandmothers, in the fragments of newsprint and magazine photography that document the visual culture she inhabited, in the amber-glass bottles and enamel-lidded compacts that appear in antique shops, with the specific pathos of objects that have outlived the rituals that gave them meaning. She existed most completely at a particular moment in American social history, the decade and a half following the Second World War, when the cosmetic industry that had been developing its commercial infrastructure since the turn of the century reached a kind of peak coherence, when the brands and the retail environment and the cultural expectations of femininity all aligned in a way that produced something genuinely distinctive, a complete and self-consistent world of beauty commerce that has not existed in quite the same form since. To understand the economy of the mid-century beauty counter is to understand that cosmetics in this period were not simply consumer goods. They were social currency, occupational uniform, and cultural signifier simultaneously, and the brands that served this market, Pond's and Revlon, and Max Factor and Hazel Bishop and Dorothy Gray and Helena Rubinstein and Coty, and Elizabeth Arden and Tangi, and the dozens of smaller regional and specialty brands that occupied particular niches within the broader landscape, were not simply selling products. They were maintaining an entire ecosystem of meaning, a shared vocabulary of femininity that women across very different economic circumstances and geographic locations could inhabit together. The geography of this ecosystem was the cosmetic counter, and it is worth spending a moment with the specific topography of that space. The department store cosmetic floor in a major American city in 1955 occupied a particular position in the building's architecture, typically on the ground floor near the main entrance, in a location that ensured every person entering the store passed through or adjacent to its sensory field. The fragrance of the floor, the combined olfactory signature of dozens of perfume testers, of opened compacts, of the particular dry warmth of heated retail space, was distinctive and immediately recognizable, a smell that women who grew up in that era report as one of the most powerful memory triggers in their experience. The lighting was warm and carefully managed, bright enough to show product but softened in ways that made the women looking in the mirrors feel favourably assessed. Each brand maintained its own counter within this larger space, and the visual language of each counter reflected the brand's identity with considerable precision. The Revlon counter was vivid, the coral and gold of the packaging, the lipstick display organised by the colour families of the brand's seasonal offering, the promotional imagery that referenced the season's advertising campaign. The Helena Rubinstein counter was more austere, more clinical in its organisational logic, reflecting the brand's scientific positioning. The Elizabeth Arden counter was serene and slightly formal, the clean packaging against white or cream display surfaces suggesting the salon interior that the brand wanted its counter to evoke. These were not random aesthetic choices. They were the physical expression of the brand's promise, the environment within which the brand's story made sense. The women who staffed these counters were the most immediate human point of contact between the brands and their customers, and the training those women received reflects the seriousness with which the major cosmetic companies approach this relationship. Max Factor trained its beauty advisors in the company's professional makeup application techniques, giving them a technical vocabulary that could bridge the gap between the professional film studio context the brand's advertising referenced and the ordinary woman's daily experience. Helena Rubinstein's consultants were schooled in the brand's skin type classification system and expected to conduct a genuine analysis before making product recommendations. Elizabeth Arden's sales staff embodied the salon culture that had built the brand, combining expert knowledge with the particular social ease of people trained to make a client feel both assessed and valued. The economic structure that sustained this system was built on a margin architecture quite different from what the contemporary beauty retail environment operates on. The department store cosmetic counter was not a store-within-a-store model in the contemporary sense. The brands maintained control over their display space and their staffing, paying the department store for floor space and drawing from the combined retail environment's traffic rather than from independently built customer relationships. This gave the brands a strong incentive to invest in the counter experience, the training, the display, the promotional events, because the counter was their direct interface with the customer, and their ability to influence the purchase experience depended entirely on what they put into it. The drugstore tier of the cosmetic market operated on a very different economy, with products selling from self-service displays without the advisory layer of the beauty consultant. This distinction was not simply a function of price, though price was always a component. It was a distinction in the nature of the transaction. The drugstore purchase was private, individual, self-directed. The woman knew what she wanted or could read the package and decide. The department store purchase was social, advisory, aspirational. The woman's needs were assessed and met within a relationship, however transient, with another person who had knowledge she lacked. These were genuinely different consumer experiences, and the brands that navigated both channels simultaneously, as Coty and Revlon and others did, were managing two different value propositions at once. What collapsed this world, gradually through the 1960s, and then with increasing momentum through the 70s and 80s, was a convergence of forces, none of which was individually decisive. The rise of the superstore and the drugstore chain reduced the primacy of the department store as a social and commercial institution. The feminist movement complicated the relationship between women and the consumption of beauty products in ways that changed how cosmetic brands could speak about themselves. The fragmentation of the media landscape made the mass magazine advertising that had built the post-war cosmetic brand's cultural authority less effective as a communication tool. The internationalization of the beauty market introduced European and eventually Asian brands with different aesthetic philosophies and different relationships to the history American women carried about what beauty products were and what they were for. The brands that had defined the mid-century beauty market found different fates as this world shifted. Revlon survived and adapted, though the specific electric cultural charge of its 1950s advertising was impossible to sustain in a market with more complex demographic assumptions. Max Factor continued as a professional and consumer line, eventually absorbed into the Procter & Gamble portfolio. Helena Rubinstein was acquired by L'Oreal and continues under the company's management with intermittent revivals of the founding brand's authority. Elizabeth Arden survives as an independent brand with continuing Red Door salon operations. Pond's remains among the most recognizable skincare brands in the world, particularly dominant in Asian markets, where the white jar's institutional authority has found a different but equally powerful cultural resonance. The trust that mid-century American women placed in these brands was real and was earned, imperfectly and over time, through a combination of genuine product quality, carefully constructed brand mythology, the social scaffolding of the retail environment, and the particular moment in American history when femininity itself was being administered with unusual institutional thoroughness. Women of that era needed the brands they used because the brands provided structure and vocabulary for a dimension of their public identity that the culture required them to maintain. The women who inherited that trust in later decades, and the women who have moved through the thoroughly different beauty economy of the present, carry something of it still, in the specific weight of a compact in the hand, in the particular ceremony of applying lipstick before leaving the house, in the quiet knowledge that taking care of your face is a form of taking care of yourself. The brands change, the ceremony persists, and somewhere beneath the contemporary beauty counter's extraordinary proliferation of options, the architecture of trust that Pond's and Revlon and Max Factor and the others built across the mid-century still bears the weight of everything that came after. The specific sensory experience of visiting a mid-century beauty counter has been reconstructed in the decades since that world's decline through a remarkable variety of oral histories, memoir fragments, and the archival recovery work of beauty historians who have recognized that the cosmetic counter was a social institution as significant in its own domain as the diner, the barbershop, or the church social. What these reconstructions consistently emphasize is not the products themselves, but the total environment, the warmth of the lighting, the particular fragrance of the floor, the texture of the glass countertop beneath a woman's fingertips as she leaned forward to examine a shade. The specific quality of attention that a well-trained beauty consultant could direct at a customer. These are the details of an experience, not of a transaction, and they point toward a truth about mid-century cosmetic commerce that purely commercial accounts consistently miss. What women were buying, at least in part, was the experience itself. The economics of beauty counter-employment in the 1950s occupied an interesting position in the broader landscape of female professional work. The beauty consultant was, by definition, a working woman, employed, possessing specialized knowledge, exercising professional judgment in customer interactions, earning a wage that in the better department store environments compared favorably with other available employment for women of the period. She was simultaneously, in the gender politics of the period, a servant of feminine aspiration, a woman whose function was to help other women achieve an appearance standard that the culture required, but that individual women might struggle to meet without expert assistance. This double position, professional expert and service worker simultaneously, was navigated with varying degrees of ease and awareness by the women who occupied it, but it produced a working environment that was in many ways more intellectually demanding and socially complex than the simpler characterization of retail labor typically allows. The promotional events that cosmetic brands organized at department store counters throughout the 1950s, the fragrance launches, the seasonal color presentations, the expert demonstrations of application technique, were genuine commercial theater that drew crowds and generated sales in ways that pure advertising could not replicate. These events required the kind of physical gathering, the shared social experience of being in a room where something exciting was being presented, that the pre-digital commercial landscape made possible through face-to-face events in ways that contemporary brands attempt to recreate through digital media with mixed results. A Revlon presentation of the season's new color direction, conducted at the cosmetic counter of a major department store with a trained demonstrator applying the new shades on willing customers, while the advertising's imagery was displayed behind her, combined the informational, social, and aspirational functions of a beauty editorial, a social event, and a sales transaction in a single experience that the participants left changed, wearing something new, knowing something they hadn't known, having been seen and attended to by someone with expertise. The decline of the mid-century beauty counter as a social institution accelerated in ways that seem, in retrospect, overdetermined. The rise of the regional shopping mall dispersed the department store traffic that had given the downtown cosmetic floor its concentrated social energy. The growth of self-service drugstore beauty aisles, where women could examine products privately and without the social performance that counter-consultation required, offered an alternative mode of purchase that suited different temperaments and different circumstances. The women's movement of the 1960s and 70s complicated the relationship between femininity and cosmetic obligation in ways that some women experienced as liberation and others as the loss of a valued practice and the resulting ambivalence about what beauty products meant and who they were for produced a more fragmented and more individually negotiated relationship with cosmetic culture than the mid-century consensus had permitted. The brands that understood this transformation earliest tended to survive it best. The ones that attempted to preserve the mid-century relationship, the intimate advisory, slightly hierarchical dynamic of expert and client, in new retail formats and new communication channels had to work very hard to maintain the warmth of the original in contexts that did not naturally support it. The ones that accepted the new terms of engagement that addressed women as individuals capable of making their own choices from an expanded range of options without the intermediary of a trained consultant's guidance, built different but in many cases equally durable relationships. What was lost in this transition was not women's engagement with beauty culture. That engagement has, if anything, deepened and diversified in the decades since the mid-century model's decline. What was lost was the specific social dimension of the beauty encounter, the ceremony of it, the way it structured time and confirmed membership in a community of women who cared, seriously and with full knowledge, about the particular discipline of looking well. That discipline persists. The ceremony that once surrounded it is, in the form it took at the mid-century beauty counter, mostly gone, surviving in fragments, in the specific quality of attention that the best contemporary beauty retailers still attempt, and in the memories of the women who were there.